Hello and welcome to Marxism School, the Basics of Marxism, Class 4, brought to you by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. We're going to have our class filing in now. And while they do, we're going to introduce what we're doing today and the differences between this and the last few classes. This one is the beginning of everything. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It's one of the greatest pamphlets of all time, taken directly from the theoretical section of one of the greatest books of all time, Anti-Düring by Friedrich Engels. And please, it's Frederick, right? Don't say Friedrich if you're American. You just end up sounding like one of those middle class types who thinks they're worldly, saying croissant instead of croissant. And nobody appreciates that. And you'll just sound even sillier than I do. And trust me, I'm silly sounding enough for all of us, believe me. Anyway, Lenin himself called Anti-Düring a handbook for all class-conscious proletarians. And that's precisely what we are, is it not? Class-conscious proletarians. This pamphlet might be the most important section of that book. It is a primer for scientific socialism. It is the beginning, the real beginning. In our previous classes, we've gone over some basic statements. We've learned how Marxists talk and a few of the things that lead us to the conclusions we have, why we say what we do, and how that's different from what we're taught by the ruling class. And it's both left and right variations. Now, we're going to really get going. Now, we are going to really begin learning Marxism. With Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, we are going to begin building the worldview of dialectical materialism in each of us, understanding what Engels sometimes refers to as the laws of the dialectic, and to butcher a quote from Engels' own self, why, quote, in the last instance, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically. And we're going to do it right after this. Okay, welcome back. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to Carlos Garrido, our co-director and fellow editor that's joined us today. You want to say hi, Carlos?
Hello, everyone.
Thanks, brother. Ever since a live stream Carlos and I did the other day, I can't look at our intro now without looking at these very horrible shots of me and getting embarrassed. Anyway, hi, everybody. Nice to see you coming back. I'd name some people, but I would be here for a minute. So before we get started with all this, let's just go over the way this class is going to work, since it's different from the first ones we did. Our first class, if you remember, was sort of a get to know you kind of class. And after that, we did 2 read-along classes where we all went over a few short essays that made some basic statements about Marxism. And then we discussed that material directly as it happened. Unfortunately, with a longer pamphlet like Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, that just isn't possible. So between last week and now, our students have all read sections 1 and 2. And if you're just watching the live stream and you're feeling a little bit nervous since you didn't read that, don't worry. We're still going to go over the material, just in a little bit different of a way. Instead of reading all of that again, I'm going to explain it. And then afterwards, me and this best class that we've had to date are going to discuss it together. If you have any questions about how this process will work, go ahead and ask now. If not, can you please hold all theoretical questions and comments until the end of the lecture? All right.
How are you doing?
Oh, go ahead.
How are you doing?
I'm awesome. Thank you. How are you, brother?
Doing good. Finished the day.
Oh, you're cutting out. I'm doing all right myself. I had a long day at work, but I'm here now with you, so it was all worth it, right? Okay. Any questions on how by the way, I appreciate that, Sam. Thank you. Any questions on how this is going to sort of go down? Beautiful. The lecture begins with section 1. Section 1 begins with Engels explaining what modern socialism was as it came into being. He says, quote, modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers, and on the other hand, of the anarchy existing in production. This sentence beautifully encapsulates the rise of the Marxist outlook. Think about it, right? He doesn't ad hoc pick something, applying a definition to the real world. Instead, Engels informs us of precisely how modern socialism, to use his words, was formed. It was the product of two things being recognized. And in the following lecture, we'll learn all about the history that creates them. But two contradictions being recognized. First, the class struggle that had developed between bourgeoisie and proletariat. And second, that production was anarchy without structure. He goes on to extend the genesis of the theoretical form of modern socialism, of a worldview rather than movement, that it is a more logical extension of the principles set down by the great French philosophers that had come before them. No one has any new thoughts at all, right? After all, other than the thoughts created by what already exists around us. Even as our updated thought is based on the material, more historically developed form of society we inhabit than our predecessors, it is also based on the thought of those predecessors. Truth is based in the relation between thinking and being. And as Engels points out by explaining and quoting Marx's The Holy Family in the introduction that all my fellow nerds read along with these two sections, it is impossible to separate thought from matter that thinks. I know that's a lot, and we just sort of jumped off the diving board into the deep end. So let's just take a second to think about that. Really think about it. It is impossible to separate thought from matter that thinks. We are created by the material premises of the world around us, shaped by it. Matter has developed, same as the societies that gave rise to those French philosophers, right? And it's created brains that have synapses and electrons and whatever else I don't know, because I really don't know a lot about the actual biological brain. But the point is that it developed into this thing that functions in a certain way, just as society developed into that thing that functions in a certain way. But Engels, he's not done after a paragraph, right? He begins the pamphlet not just here, but by describing the development of utopian socialism during the time Hegel described the world as standing on its head. A very typical Hegel statement, meaning many things at the same time. The world claimed to be led by principles arriving from thought, from the head, right? Engels says that every form of society and government existing at the time had been, quote, flung into the lumber room as irrational, that the world had hitherto allowed itself to be led solely by prejudices, and now the kingdom of reason was appearing to shine the light of day on superstition, injustice, feudal privilege, and oppression, replaced with eternal truth, eternal right, equality based on nature, and the inalienable rights of man. This, of course, we know from history, was far-fetched. Eternal right was actually bourgeois right. What was actually realized in the real world was bourgeois society. Just as Engels tells us, the great thinkers who believed they were doing this work, holding everything up to the judgment of reason, TM, could not go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch. Those men and the rich burghers or city folks who were more and more in contradiction with the feudal nobility were able to put themselves forward as representing not one special class, which they were in reality, but all of humanity, including the poor workers, who were rightly rather pissed with the rich idlers, as we generally are. Why? Because it was a feudal nobility who were the ruling class. So in this way, the burghers who would become the bourgeoisie could represent the interests of the toiling masses against them. Of course, this also contained within it the antagonism between those burghers and those toiling masses, right? That's why Engels makes sure to tell us about all of the independent outbursts that broke out, the German Reformation, Peasants' War, the Anabaptists, etc. Now, this gets us to the beginning of the call for not just the class privileges of the nobility abolished, but the equality of all people's social conditions. This is the rise of utopian socialism. Take note that Engels describes it arising, right? The conditions and thought that create it, rather than how a bourgeois thinker would describe it, magically arriving in the minds of the great Robert Owen, Fourier, or Saint-Simon, whom he rightly says were above the rest, the greatest of the utopians. But here's the rub with them. As brilliant as they were, none of them were representing the interests of the proletariat. At the time, the new class history had produced that was the social formation capable of, whose interests necessitated moving society forward to something new. And if you'll remember our class last week, what does Lenin say about finding a revolutionary subject? He says that within change, we must find that social formation that, owing to its position within society, not only can but must necessitate a change to a newer order. Instead, just like the earlier French philosophers, all of these utopians claimed to represent and liberate all of humanity all at once. They were in this sense similar, right? They claimed to bring that kingdom of reason and eternal justice just on a higher stage of development than the thinkers that came before them. And it is very similar to the new utopians of today. The reformers, just like Owen, though not quite as brilliant, who find the world irrational and unjust and believe it is simply that people have not understood their ideas well enough that it is still this way. So they seek to convince everyone of the moral correctness of their cause, dismissing everyone who does not take them seriously as unenlightened rabble. I want to point out for me and for the Institute, this is a perfect example of the purity fetish. And Engels points it out without using the words purity fetish, even in this. This, anyway, Engels points out, is also how the original utopians viewed everything. They could have been born at that time, 500 years before, or 500 years after, or however many years after it is right now, you know? The point is that they appeal to reason and to a sense of morality rather than understanding where this reason and morality even come from. Even the reason of the 18th century in its actual realized form turned into the reign of terror and saw the bourgeoisie losing confidence in its own power and political ability, taking refuge first in the directorate and then Napoleonic despotism. And why? Because as we will learn in this class and the ones following, class struggle is objective. We cannot speak of one class or another as not opposed to another class. The bourgeoisie could no more represent the interests of all of humanity in a direct sense than the proletariat could. The proletariat is instead representing all of humanity in a long-term way, in its ability to carry society forward to a new era without the bourgeoisie by overcoming the bourgeoisie. The bourgeois class considered among these eternal rights that we mentioned, by the way, the right to property, of course. And how could it not? It was their class enemy who prevented them from accumulating it, and now they were free to do so. But this property, this is the crux of the matter of objective class contradiction. Their freedom of property from feudal chains after the French Revolution turned out to be nothing more than the freedom of small proprietors to sell their property to the larger ones because of a complete inability to compete. And for everyone but those rapidly accumulating big bourgeoisie, the freedom from property. As Engels says, quote, "The development of industry upon a capitalist basis made poverty and misery of the working masses conditions of existence of society. Cash payments became the point of contact between people. Crime skyrocketed. New vices developed to replace the old feudal ones, and the liberty, fraternity, and equality of the revolution became ruthless competition, impoverishment, and crime and vice. The oppression of force enforced by the feudal lords became the oppression of gold enforced by the bourgeoisie." And I want to quote this part as it is really important to understand. The right of first night was transferred from the feudal lords to the bourgeois manufacturers. Prostitution increased to an extent never heard of before in history. Marriage itself remained as before. The legally recognized form, the official cloak of prostitution, and moreover was supplemented by rich crops of adultery. All this to say what actually arose in the real world was nothing but a caricature of the triumph of reason. And this is where the thinkers who would criticize these developments come from, where Saint-Simon and Robert Owen come from. Let's go directly to what Engels says again. After this section where he covers the French Revolution, on page 40, he says, "At this time, however, the capitalist mode of production, and with it the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, was still very incompletely developed. He explains that this situation creates not only that conflict he just mentioned between the classes, but also between the productive forces themselves and the forms of exchange created by them." Right? So a contradiction within the system itself. This is why we often call capitalism contradictory value creation or contradictory value accumulation. These are objective contradictions that exist in the very way society develops. This crude early capitalism could only produce then crude early theories, right? It was not very developed. How could it be anything but that? Society had not yet developed to a point where a scientific view of the whole process could be had, as the process was only in its infancy. And so the great thinkers of the utopians were sort of left to imagine their way out of the crisis. Imagine they did. They worked out intricate plans of ideal societies and tried their very best to persuade the ruling class of the immorality of their ways and the devastation it caused the people. The more intricate and worked out their utopian societies, though, the more they ended up veering off into fantasy. Engels had sort of a last jab at those who, in his era, having developed past that point, still clung to such old notions before this section ends, by the way, saying we can leave such things to them, calling them literary small fries, and basically saying to let them quibble over fantasies that only make us smile. The next part describes the theory of the three great utopians. So that's Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. And just as a side note, includes pictures of each of the thinkers that in no way whatsoever resemble Shel Silverstein cartoons. They don't. Don't look at them. They don't resemble them at all. We're not going to go as in-depth as Engels does, by the way, but feel free to ask any questions after the lecture if you want to know more about them. We'll do a sort of a highlights reel, I guess. We're going to begin with Saint-Simon, the son of the great French Revolution, the man Engels calls, along with Hegel, quote, the most encyclopedic mind of his time, which is high praise, right? It's important to note that while he's criticizing him, right? So Engels isn't ever criticizing them to condemn them and say, dismiss everything they've done, in a purity fetish sort of way. He respects their work and their contributions. At the same time, he understands their limitations. And this is how we, as Marxists today, need to approach these problems. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. I need a little seltzer. Okay. Let's see. Saint-Simon, right? For Saint-Simon, the antagonisms that the French Revolution exposed in society, they create everything. The third estate for him is everything. For Saint-Simon, to quote Engels, the antagonism between the third estate and the privileged classes took the form of an antagonism between workers and idlers. The idlers, though, were not merely the old privileged classes, but also all who, without taking any part in production or distribution, lived on those incomes. And the workers were not only the wage workers, but also the manufacturers, the merchants, and the bankers. The French Revolution, settled the question of the intellectual and political leadership the idlers could provide, and the reign of terror proved those of the third estate without property could not lead for him. So who else but the working bourgeoisie, uniting itself with the propertyless by way of a new religious bond. And this, his class collaborationism and inability to see the rapidly growing antagonism based on the objective contradiction between these classes of people is readily apparent, right? He was brilliant, and the recognition of the French Revolution as a class struggle was at the time incredibly progressive and new. But his utopianism was based on the unity of all of these productive people against the feudal lords and on subjective notions of morality. Interestingly, however, he does lay stress on the conditions of the class he calls most numerous and poor. And so his utopian vision included what, in his view, was a way to achieve a better life for all. Saint-Simon begins his tradition, really, and we find in him the embryo of the other two we're going to talk about, which leads us to the next one on the list, Fourier. Engels calls him one of the greatest satirists of all time, actually, for his wit in taking down the machinations and frauds of the early French bourgeoisie, saying that, quote, he lays bare remorselessly the material and moral misery of the bourgeois world. So just as an aside, don't let anyone tell you that Marxists don't have moral critiques. Marxism itself is scientific, but we possess morality. We have our own code, our own ethics, our own values, as we see Engels sort of pointing out right now when he talks about the misery of the bourgeois world. Anyway, Fourier is where we derive a criticism of the existing conditions of society, no matter where we're at. His premise lies in the high promises of the French Revolution, ending in the further immiseration of the people, of the kingdom of reason, TM, becoming nothing but the kingdom of the bourgeoisie. He also begins categories to view the history of society within. The famous savagery, barbarism, patriarchate, and civilization notions. His mistake in believing that society is moving in a sort of circle and constantly reproduces conditions without being able to solve them is again a result of the limitations of his epoch. Bourgeois society had simply not advanced enough yet to disprove the notion, and in no way discounts his contribution to the science of society and history. Just as the idealism of Hegel in no way discounts his immense contribution to human thought with his system. Interestingly, Fourier was something of a dialectician himself, arguing that historical phases have periods of ascent and descent, which he applied to the future of the human race. The lead up to the section on Robert Owen, by the way, Engels makes sure to mention, is based in the progress of society. It's important, so I'm going to quote it at length here. Whilst in France, the hurricane of the revolution swept over the land, in England, a quieter, but not on that account less tremendous revolution was going on. Steam and the new tool-making machinery were transforming manufacture into modern industry, and thus revolutionizing the whole foundation of bourgeois society. The sluggish march of development of the manufacturing period changed into a veritable storm and stress period of production. With constantly increasing swiftness, the splitting up into large capitalists and non-possessing proletarians went on. Between these, instead of the former stable middle class, an unstable mass of artisans and small shopkeepers, the most fluctuating portion of the population, now led a precarious existence. Side note, what does this sound like? The former middle class, stable in the US, being led in a way to a more precarious position in the service sector and in debt, right? Anyway, the new mode of production was, as yet, only at the beginning of its period of ascent. As yet, it was the normal, regular method of production, the only one possible under existing conditions. Nevertheless, even then it was producing crying social abuses. The herding together of a homeless population in the worst quarters of the large towns, the loosening of all traditional moral bonds, of patriarchal subordination, of family relations over work, especially of women and children, to a frightful extent. And think about how bad it would have to be for Engels in that era to call it a frightful extent. Complete demoralization of the working class, suddenly flung into altogether new conditions, from the country into the town, from agriculture into modern industry, from stable conditions of existence into insecure ones that change from day to day. Think about that for a second, just a second, what this means, what all of this sort of adds up to, this stable way of life being flung into this insecurity and instability. Anyway, we need to pay place. Can't talk. We need to pay close attention to this section, though, and what Engels lays emphasis on in order to understand the development of revolutionary potential, which will be discussed in section 2. For now, though, let's go to the great Robert Owen, a man Engels called one of the few born leaders of men. Engels clearly respects Owen a great deal, as unlike the other two major utopians, he takes great care to explain how Owen became Owen, giving his origin story, as my son would say. Owen was a manufacturing bourgeoisie who saw the immiseration of the working people and simply could not abide it. His business acumen and head for how to make an enterprise successful aided him in his attempts to create humanitarian working environments for the people working in his factories. It was in his first utopian colony, New Lanark. The working day was only 10 and a half hours, where everywhere else it was upwards of 13 or 14. He basically created the concept of preschool also, founding what were called infant schools at New Lanark, where children enjoyed themselves so much that parents had a hard time getting them to leave when school was over for the day. When a crisis in cotton stopped work for 4 months, every single worker received full wages the entire time. How many of us would like that right now, you know? New Lanark had no real crime to speak of, no prostitution, none of the vices the utopians were always criticizing. And still, Owen was not satisfied. The conditions he had provided were not worthy of human beings. Of this, Owen said, the people were slaves at my mercy. None of this, for Owen, and proven by history, by the way, would allow the rational development of the human character and intellect in all directions, much less the free exercise of all their faculties. With Robert Owen, we see not only a fighter for justice, but an embryonic form of the source of value, believe it or not. Through objectively looking at how profits were made, Owen realized that all of the wealth created by the new machinery, factories, etc., that was being used to fund the wars of Europe in opposition to Napoleon and the Republic, in support of the aristocracy and their way of life, could not have happened without the workers operating and creating them. He says, quote, the new power was the creation of the working classes, and to them, therefore, the fruits of this new power belonged. To quote Engels talking about it. Let's continue quoting Engels on it for a minute, though, because it's, to use my son's terminology again, a banger. The newly created gigantic productive forces, hitherto used only to enrich individuals and to enslave the masses, offered to Owen the foundations for a reconstruction of society. They were destined, as the common property of all, to be worked for the common good of all. Owen's contributions to communism, therefore, are on this sort of business model basis, but his turn in this direction of the call to reform society overall, rather than simply his own businesses, brought him smack up against the ruling class. So long as he was only a philanthropist, he got their acclaim, the proverbial high five from the powers that be. But when he pointed out that all society functioned in this horrible way and suggested changing it, he was met with isolation. He was frozen out of the press and all of civil society. He used his fortune to maintain more utopian colonies as long as he could before it ran dry. And then he turned to the working class and worked within it, one of us, for the next 30 years. During that time, after a 5-year struggle, he helped win the first law limiting the labor hours of women and children. We could list his accomplishments, but there are a lot, and it's already a long lecture. I mean, we've been going for a half hour. So let's just get past it. Owen was a great man, and communists will always remember him fondly and view his contributions with respect. All of these great utopians added something, of course. They were part of the foundation of scientific socialism, just as Lenin told us, right? It was one of the 3 components, the sort of the foundations of Marxism. But to create this, we need to move beyond utopian ideas and moral condemnation. To make a science of socialism, we need to place it upon a real basis. And that's the end of the first section. So before we sort of get into the next part of the lecture, what do you guys think of the motivating factors for them, huh? Does anyone have any, since we were just talking about Owen, does anyone have any comments or questions about Owen? What created the need for Robert Owen to do his work? Yeah, go ahead, Wade.
I'd say it's probably the explosion of manufacture creating more wealth, but also like deepening the poverty. People, when you can overproduce, then the small farms, go under because they can't compete. And if you're what you produce is less valued than what it takes to sustain your life, you find a place to go where you can sustain your life, and that ended up being the cities and the urban centers where manufacturing was happening. And because all of these people ended up pouring into the same place all at the same time, it's not like industry could scale up, to meet the population insurge. And so, boom, you got a bunch of, impoverished people that have to resort to, crime for survival because there's literally just nothing else.
Yeah, this is what creates what Marx and Engels called the dangerous class or the lumpen proletariat. It's important to note, though, that it's the decaying elements of all classes, right? Not just former peasants that couldn't find work, but those small manufacturers and small bourgeoisie that were outcompeted, all joined the ranks of the lumpen or dangerous class or criminals. Marx and Engels sort of go off on them. They really were not big fans. Matt, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I was going to say that this was sort of the start of urbanization, and I feel like Robert Owen was kind of at like the crux point where, like Wade was just saying, the peasants were all moving to the inner cities, and there were no infrastructure there to support it all, so it just became a free for all, and that was sort of the beginning of like sociology and urbanization.
Well said, brother. I think what I think is really telling in this is how the ruling class treated Owen before he wanted to change all of society, right? All of these bourgeoisie, even the aristocracy, saw the immiseration of the people. Owen put his money where his mouth was, right? He said, these people are living in subhuman conditions. I can do something about it, so I will, right? And he won acclaim. People loved him. All of the ruling class, he was a sort of darling of the aristocracy. But then when he was like, yo, you guys should do the same thing, this ain't right, they were like, hold on a minute. No, this is where my profits and incomes come from. And they isolated him. Go ahead, Cheryl.
It just this sort of reminds me of the thought that if there is almost enough for everyone, then people have a tendency to share and try to make sure that everybody gets barely enough. But if there's an abundance, so that everyone can have an abundance, there tends to be a hoarding of it by a few people, and a lot of people get pretty much nothing.
I think it's important to note, and we're going to go over this actually a little bit later in the lecture, that within capitalism, poverty is created by that abundance, right? And we're going to go through that. Ed, you were next, but thank you. That was very well said, Cheryl.
Yeah, excuse my ignorance. I'm learning all this, but it sounds a lot like this is where the whole idea of social democracy came from. The utopian socialism that the bourgeoisie is like, well, we'll keep the masses. I mean, maybe Owens was well-intentioned, but the others were like, well, we'll keep the masses quiet. We'll keep the proletariat quiet by giving them, throwing them these breadcrumbs, as opposed to having a society that was truly democratic and where that abundance was more properly shared.
I'm really sorry, Ed, but I'm not going to be able to forgive the ignorance. How dare you not know things that the ruling class has specifically tried to prevent you learning? How dare you, sir? I'm just kidding.
Okay.
You're sort of in the right realm. We can get into the beginning of social democracy and things like that in a little bit. Maybe at the end of the lecture. I believe what was Ben next?
I suppose with my comments is that when we look at the history of utopian socialism and these theorists, I think Owens comes closest to understanding kind of material necessity and specifically how the division of labor breaks down. You know, as we, I forget who specifically said it, but again, the overcrowding of cities is a result of this wage competition, which Marx outlines pretty well in Wage, Labor, and Capital. You know, when we take a look at that, whilst they get a lot of slack for primarily morally critiquing, I think within utopian socialism, we begin to see also that materialistic basis, which is forced by necessity. That's just my one comment I wanted to make.
Very, very well said, brother. And I think Engels takes great care to point that out, right? That this is the foundation of things, that Marxism couldn't have arisen without this. I see Carlos sitting there patiently with his hand up. This is the man I interrupt more than any other person on this planet. Go ahead, Carlos. You can interrupt me, brother. It's okay.
No. I just wanted to make a comment, but let Emily and JB go first, please. They had their hands up.
Oh, I saw JB put his down, but Emily, I thought you had too. I apologize. Go ahead, Emily.
No problem. I was just gonna say, when we're talking about the rise of urbanization, then that's an economic condition that's bringing more people together, but that also is a breakdown of prior social relationships that were relied on in the earlier system, so that, you know, people are being thrust together in these new economic conditions without established societal connections and relationships that would have existed in earlier, you know, forms of society. So I think perhaps that is part of what results in the conditions that are being observed and complained of. And that kind of ties in also, I think, although I don't know a lot about it, the idea of the disappearance of the commons as we move from feudalism into more nascent capitalism and industrialization. The commons shrink, meaning that there's no longer spaces that were once for everybody to kind of use for subsistence.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Marx goes into this in his chapter in Capital on the myth of so-called primitive accumulation. Basically, in Western Europe, we had enclosure movements, right? In the US, we had something similar in westward expansion and continual land grabs from the industrialists. They would grab it from everybody, especially Native Americans, especially any lands that had resources on them. Coal was big, etc. I see JB put your hand back up, so why don't you go next, brother?
Yeah, I was just curious about the role that Owen played, because now if you feel free to laugh, but my question is, it sounds almost kind of like, you remember when Elon Musk asked the question of how much would it take to, I think it was end homelessness in the country, if I'm correct.
I think it was end hunger.
Or hunger.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he said something like $6 billion, something like that, right? And then as soon as people actually gave him the accurate number, how much it would cost, he disappeared. He just didn't want to do it. And part of me thinks that, did somebody like Elon Musk lack the brass ones that somebody like Owen had in order to actually address it? Because we got to remember that people who are part of the bourgeoisie, they are also under a certain type of influence and peer pressure to keep that class interest intact. And so do you think that it might have been something similar for, like, there was a desire at first, but because of, it's not just greed, but it's also a peer pressure, a class peer pressure that also may have pushed somebody like Elon Musk to kind of, you know, recant his desire to provide for the masses?
I think that is a really, really insightful question. First of all, I think there is absolutely no comparison between Robert Owen and Elon Musk. Owen is a man of steel, and Musk is sort of a little squishy mushroom man. But regarding the ability of Musk to end hunger, so the situation was he said, like, people always ask him to do something good with his money. So if someone came up with a plan to end hunger, he would do it. And so they came back with this plan. The issue is that the plan was not a real plan that could actually accomplish this. And Musk knew it when he was saying that. You have to actually change the social relations of production to actually end hunger. Otherwise, you're doing a good thing. You're feeding a ton of people, but you're not really ending hunger. You need to create new institutions, new organizations, new means of distributing food, of producing that food, right? And doing this would cost a lot of money. Yes, maybe even somewhere near the amount they told Musk, but it would also require new socialist forms of production. And no one in the bourgeoisie, Musk or even the ones sort of taunting him with this, can allow that to happen.
Thank you.
Oh, for sure, brother. It was a good question. Carlos, do you want to go or?
Sure. Yeah, the comments that Emily gave about enclosure are important. That was a process literally of privatization, not unlike what's really intensified in the 70s during this era that we've called neoliberalism. And some estimates say that it started in Europe well before Marx even thought it started by. Marx, I think, begins to trace it to the 15-ish century. Some estimates have seen in Italy it start around the 12th century. And at this time, you're talking about, if it starts in the 12th, you're talking about maybe 5 or 6 centuries where there isn't an industrial capitalism that has developed. So people are getting kicked off their lands and there really isn't nowhere to go. It's really with the development of industrial capitalism where when they get kicked off their land, they can go to the urban centers and get a job and work for 14 hours a day, walk an hour to work and walk an hour back. Dreadful existence. But what happens to those people before, when there weren't those industrial centers where the proletariat could be at? That's where you begin to see the development of prisons, the development of asylums, because of course desperation brings both crime, and then it brings certain forms of sociality that would end up being considered insane. And you have the development of the prisons, you have the development of the mental asylums, and then you also have, in certain ways, the development of these armies that can then go abroad and conquest, for instance, the Americas and other parts of the world. So that process of enclosure and deep privatization that happens in Europe, it precedes some of the colonization that then also sets the ground for the development of capitalism. Often today, it's this period, which is sometimes referred to, I think, wrongly as primitive accumulation. Marx calls it so-called primitive accumulation, but this period, which is somewhat the condition for the possibility of the development of capitalism, is often reduced to simply the process of colonizing the Americas. And that follows a specific trend that usually ignores, the role of the exploitation of workers in the global north as well. And it's important not to forget either, because the privatization and the difficulties in many ways started in the process of enclosure in Europe and then extended themselves in many similar ways and sometimes even harsher ways in the colonization of the Americas. But that's one point I wanted to give. The point that I wanted to give before that was maybe clarificational. I know one of the things that I struggled to see early on was this point that's given often. It's given in the manifesto. It's given a few times. Every time they talk about the utopian socialists, which is that their deficiencies in large part are rooted in the historical moment that they were in and in the development of the productive forces in that moment. And I don't think it's often intuitive why that connection has to be made. So in case anyone, doesn't see how those two things are connected, a good image that I like to bring up is the one of a movie, right? And this is one that I use in my writings on dialectical materialism and on the idea of the ascension from the abstract to concrete, which is that you end up really understanding something and its essential characteristics and understanding it comprehensively when it's developed, when you've seen it develop. So I can't grasp the essence of The Godfather if I'm 30 minutes into the movie, right? Even if I just watch the first movie, I still don't have the essence of the Godfather trilogy grasped, right? So what I'm trying to get to here, to get back to the bag of bananas at hand, to use Noah's favorite expression, is that if you are at a moment in the late 18th century or very early 19th century, specifically in countries where capitalism has not developed a lot, you're not seeing that full picture. You're not seeing the capitalism that has gotten to a stage where you've already seen the equivalent of seeing like the first two movies of the Godfather trilogy, where you could start talking about the Godfather and know it systematically and comprehensively and see the interconnections and the development of the movie and the various themes and how they relate to one another, right? There's a point that Nikolai Chernyshevsky makes that history gives the bones to the folks of the past, and then it gives the marrow, really the good stuff, to the people that come after. They're able to understand things better. Marx has a comment in the Grundrisse, which are the series of manuscripts he composes in 1858, 1859, where he says that we get to know the anatomy of the ape through the anatomy of the human, which is that we learn things about the past really well when we can see them in how they unfold into something new. And we learn about previous class societies through capitalism. We can postulate the thesis about the universal character of class struggle, thanks to the development of a class society such as capitalism. And the point is that you can't see that systematic character, which allows you to see the proletariat as the historical emancipatory agent. You can't see that until capitalism has developed to a point where it gets to in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, specifically after the 1848 revolutions. You can't see that, and you can't come up with the thesis that Marx and Engels are able to come up with up until that point, right? So, maybe I'm just projecting a difficulty that I had in making that connection, and maybe all of you were able to get it almost instantaneously. But for me, providing an alternative image of why it is that really to understand something, you need to be able to see it comprehensively, and to see it comprehensively, it itself needs to develop to that point. I found that important, and I was often confused, like, well, why is this the case? And it really makes sense if you bring the same sort of relations to examples that are easier perhaps to comprehend.
Thank you so much for adding that, because it is a part that Engels sort of takes for granted that everybody will grasp right away. And I know I didn't. My big problem when I was learning this stuff was mechanism. And you see this sort of people making a mistake of mechanism without knowing it. I mean, I see it in people who've been at this, longer than I have, right? It really ingrains itself deeply. For me, I couldn't get that the thoughts didn't just pile on top of each other one after another. That, oh, Marx just came along and corrected what Hegel got wrong. Oh, Hegel just came along and corrected what Kant got wrong. But that society had to develop to a certain point to be able to create these problems and solutions, to be able to see the things happening and see it more clearly. And
can I give a quick? Sorry.
No, go ahead, Carlos. That's okay.
I was just going to say, can I give a quick reply to JB? Because he said, I feel like this was way over my head. And I actually had an example in my notebook that I forgot to mention, which was his example, which is the example of the butterfly and the various moments of the butterfly. I had to look it up, but it's caterpillar, pupa moment, which is when they're like in the little sac. And then you have the butterfly. This utopian socialism actually, the moment that Engels is looking at, which is Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, that's basically like the late pupa stage and the equivalent of the analysis, the critical analysis of capitalism. You have, before that in the 1500s, Thomas More, and you have Campanella. And then in the late 17th, early 18th century, you have other figures like Gerald Winstanley and the Diggers in England. And then you have in the late 18th century and early 19th century, these utopian socialists that he's talking about. So the point that I want to make is that you're able to better understand what a butterfly is and all the moments of the butterfly once you've seen the development of the three stages: the caterpillar stage, the pupa stage, and then the butterfly stage, right? The utopian socialists of like the 15th century and 17th century, they were only able to see the caterpillar stage. And so the comments that they were able to make about capitalism as a system, about what they were observing, about the potentials of going beyond it, were limited to a very limited understanding, because the thing that they were analyzing was itself not developed yet, right? Imagine passing judgment on a human being and their potential and their ability and their essence as a human being when they're only 12 years old or something, right? You need to see the development of the human being to really understand it comprehensively. The utopian socialists that Engels deals with here, they're basically at this later stage of the pupa stage, or the beginning of the butterfly stage. And they're getting things and understanding capitalism in ways that are much more concrete than Thomas More, Campanella, Gerald Winstanley, and the others. But they still don't have the potential to see the whole picture, because that thing which they're looking at itself hasn't been concretized as a whole picture, right? The butterfly hasn't developed yet. And the butterfly develops with Marx and Engels, and then develops a little more with Lenin. And so they're able to provide the fuller picture. Within that, not just a systematic and scientific understanding of capitalism, but imbued within that, what element within capitalism allows you to move beyond it. Like moving beyond capitalism is a task of going through it, of overcoming it, of taking a rational kernel in it and developing it forward while you're canceling another part of it, and not just like harmonizing the contradictions and escaping them into this alternative utopian community, which was the form that their political activism would take. Specifically, in most of these communities, communist utopian communities, were within the U.S. I hope that helps, GB.
Thank you so much for adding that, Carlos. First, I want to say we have like a little visitor to our class today. This is Professor Hugo Chavez von Gingerpants, and he's wonderful. Anyway, for anyone who may be feeling a little lost, or like we're going through a bunch of stuff, let me sort of just explain and break down what Engels is doing here. That's an adorable cat. He is giving us the thinking that creates Marxism, and now he's going to teach us next, in the next section, teach us how to understand that and why it's important and where it comes from. The next section, we begin dialectics. So really what we're doing is sort of starting our minds thinking about things in their relationships and in their history, because that's what this is kind of a history lesson. I believe, Kyle, you were next.
So I just wanted to point out, because we've got the YouTube chat pulled up here, and Marius Trotter, if I'm saying that name correctly, I apologize, I'm probably butchering it, said Owen addressed the U.S. Congress twice on the subject of socialism, once with Thomas Jefferson in the audience. It's the first public record of discussion of socialism in the United States. And so I just wanted to make sure, because I thought that was a really solid comment. And then we have a couple other comments.
Real quick. Owen and Jefferson actually corresponded. And Owen sort of explained his utopian colonies to Jefferson because they were here in the U.S., right? Jefferson actually loved the ideas. A lot of people don't know this about him because, I mean, he's a really complicated person, but Jefferson in his writing was a very, very moralistic sort of figure. He was a staunch abolitionist, even though he owned slaves. He was Jeffersonian democracy was at the time incredibly progressive, and for him, really the empowerment of the people. And so Owen was saying, look, you want to empower the people. This is how we do it. This is how we raise humanity up, because he saw in Jefferson someone who wanted to do that. And Jefferson loved the ideas. And in fact, he pointed to the Iroquois and a couple other native tribes that lived in a similar manner and said that it worked very well for them. Jefferson's issue was that he didn't believe it could transfer to a larger nation state sized project, in that you would have corruption, you would have the slave owners, you would have all of this other stuff. So that's a really interesting thing to add. I believe, Sam, you were next.
Yeah. I just had a question. I guess it kind of had been covered with what Carlos had been saying, but Engels says that the great thinkers of the 18th century were no more able than their predecessors to go beyond the limits imposed on them by their own epoch. Now, I'm assuming that's just universally true in that when you're in 5th grade, you know everything up until 5th grade, but you don't know what's going to happen in 6th grade. And when you get to 6th grade, now you know everything up until then, but you're still limited by your 6th graderness. So my question is, and this is a much bigger question, so more it's one to just think about, how is it that we are limited in the same way in our current epoch? Now that we have all of these different traditions that have criticized each other and developed out of that, how is it that we're still limited in that being the case, but are we less so limited in that we have all of this to draw on? So yeah, it's more of just a general question.
I think that's one that we can all think about for a while. Not necessarily answer right now, but maybe discuss later on after class. I think that would be good. Let it sort of marinate. Oh God, I had something to say and it fell out of my head. So go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, I just want to say something about that. I think of ideological entrenchment is the most successful when people think that they've escaped ideology, which is another way of saying when they think that they've been able to successfully escape the way that the dominant social relations and their epoch reflected themselves in the forms of ideas, and the way that reflection itself gets embodied in individuals as thought. And that's when it's the most entrenched. And in many ways, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, you start to see people categorizing the age that we live in as post-ideological, in the sense that these barriers that ideology was supposed to provide human thinking that limited it was conceived to have been overcome, now that the end of history has gotten here. It is in that moment when I think that the limitations have gotten to a very developed form. And I think we have certain forms of that in the left, with people who consider themselves Marxist, socialist, etc. And because they conceive of themselves as having broken through bourgeois ideology, they are often unable to see the limits that are actually still there, operative in their thinking and in their social analysis. And part of what we are trying to do with this purity fetish studies and seeing the different ways that it manifests itself is precisely that. This is because we don't criticize the purity fetish in people that don't consider themselves Marxists or socialists. We do it precisely in the ones that do, because those are the people that think that they've escaped bourgeois ideology, but in reality, their forms of thinking, their outlook are still shaped by the limitations of bourgeois thought.
Well said, brother. Ben, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, this is just going to be really quick, and it's kind of maybe attempting to lead us into the section about dialectics, because I think I've seen a lot of people, at least in the Zoom chat, and I haven't been looking at the YouTube chat, but the Zoom chat be quite confused potentially about what's going on. And that is primarily because when we look at how Engels outlines materialism, dialectics really is the key to understanding that. And it's especially when we think about the moralism isn't simply a result of what, as you said, obviously, the conditions present don't necessarily allow you to think beyond your epoch. When that epoch arises, when you are able to, dialectics becomes that precisely because it understands that the process of change, whatever change it may bring, it is those negative elements which become themselves a new positive. As money becomes this nexus between which we all intermingle, that can also itself becomes a way to develop the force of production. And as that continues, that creates its own abundance. And although, again, abundance creates its own poverty, so does that poverty continue to create abundance. That's why you can have, for instance, Deng Xiaoping theory, where it's focused primarily on developing those forces of production in order to better class struggle later, because those negative elements become the fertilization of that new positive, more interconnected position at which humanity can end up. It's why we have things like the internet, wherein that came about and allowed us to not destroy but fundamentally alter a lot of ways that we interacted as alienated people without that means of communication. So the development in that means of communication has allowed us to, it's given us this, but it's also given us various new forms of social expression. And that's it. Sorry.
No need to apologize. That was great, brother. I think Ben brings up something that's a really good demonstration of thinking about things dialectically. Do you remember when Engels was saying that with the oppression of the sword, of the old feudal violent oppression, became primarily the oppression of gold, right? That humanities began to interact at the point of monetary exchange, at the point of the dollar or gold or whatever it is. Money is sort of the signifier of this end of the old stable relations, right? The old peasant and feudal lord relations. And so it's negative, it's destruction, right? It's destroying those. At the same time, however, it is its opposite. It is creation. It is creating something new. It is leading to the buildup of bourgeois society, which leads to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, right? And then the next thing in our case is socialism within the creation of money, therefore is the abolition of money. It's its own end, right? And don't worry if that seems like a lot. I know it is. We're going to get into why those sort of seeming contradictions make sense in the next few minutes, actually. Kyle, you had something else to add?
Yeah, just keeping up with the YouTube comments here. Let me get back to where it was. So, oh shoot, did they delete? Oh no, here it is. Okay. Andreas Reyes says, like Lenin, talking about we can only go as far as our epoch. They said, like Lenin mentioning in Imperialism, that Marx and Engels could guess at monopoly capitalism, but could not describe how it would develop into financial imperialism because it hadn't yet. And so just another good comment from the YouTube section here.
Excellent. Thank you. One last one from JB, and then we'll get back into it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you just said. Now, I'm mulling this over in my head, and you're seeing the hamster running the wheel as you look at my face. So basically what you're saying is that this is a human evolutionary process. So the systems that we put in as human beings, it evolves from one better process to another. So we go from feudalism to capitalism, and then from capitalism, we move on to things like socialism. But at the same time, there's a part of me that also thinks that maybe, just maybe, we had it correctly in some societies back then, but was it more of a a breakdown? You know, because there are some cultures, like for instance, some indigenous cultures that have more of a socialist and communist type of structure. So we kind of deviated from that, but now we're reverting back to the way which works best for human beings. Does that make sense?
A little bit. So I think you're sort of viewing it as if we got things right and should have stayed there. But instead we did this, right? And you'll notice, like you bring up, there were Native American communities, the same ones Jefferson was talking about, right? That lived in this sort of communal way. But here's the thing: the development isn't really a choice. It's happening all around us. It's a fact of society. And what Marx says is that we go, what's the term he used? The return to the community on a higher level of development. So remember that all things develop and then undevelop, right? That we had a sort of society before class, and property develops as we get better at producing the things that make us society, that help us live. And we keep evolving along these lines. And this property keeps changing forms until this sort of property itself becomes developed to such a state that it's no longer even necessary, it's obsolete. And we have such an abundance that we have to, rather than choose to, return to the community on this higher level of development, because there's no point in separating through property anymore. There's that much. Hegel, I think, would view things a little differently from Marx on this. What do you think about it, Carlos?
Yeah, I think that the person, so JB, you're right. There were societies that, from the standpoint of say, the society that as Marxists were striving for, classless, no exploitation, no alienation, the direct appropriation of the things we produce by the people that produce them. There were societies that were like that, and in that sense, they had already gotten it right. And these are the societies that exist before the development of class society. What they were missing, the limitations that were upon them, were not social limitations, they were natural limitations. They had not developed the forces of production, and therefore they frequently ran across obstacles that were tied to nature. They weren't tied to like the obstacles today where you can't get food, not because there isn't food, but because your job's not, you're not getting paid enough, or you got laid off, or those are, artificial social obstacles that are related to the acquisition of the things that you need. The obstacles were of a different character. They were tied to nature. And here I think that the development of how we transition from classless to class society, the picture that someone like Rousseau paints in his discourse on the origins of inequality is, very much in line with what the evidence has shown us, and the evidence that then grounds Marx's analysis of the transition from classless to class society. And it's that idea that obstacles arise in meeting your needs. When those obstacles arise, you have to realize how to overcome them, and you end up developing techniques and technology that improves production. Out of that improvement in production, you end up developing at some point a surplus. You end up making more than what you need to satisfy the needs of the community. And then a group has to decide what the hell is going to be done with that surplus. And out of that emerges class society. Out of that emerges more specifically the monogamous relations that end up functioning as the unit that can take this form of property that was communal and now make it private so that it could be handed down through generations. So again, let's remember that the title of Engels' great book is The Order at Which Things Arise, the Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, right? So that's what I would say. Natural obstacles arise. we end up having to figure out how to overcome them. In that process, we're forced almost naturally to develop our skills in such a way that it allows us to produce better. Better production means surplus. Surplus means class society, family, and the origins of the hell that we've lived in, but that has a tremendous potential for returning us to, the heavenly world of communism, but with abundance now and without any natural limitations.
Thank you so much for saying that way better than I could have. I don't remember who was first, Ed or Emily. If one of you do, just go ahead.
I have a question directly following up on what Carlos just said.
Sure.
Does that mean, because it seems to me we could use historical materialism, does it have any use then as a way of examining earlier societies that we're not living under, what we would consider our modern capitalist, or even at the time of Marx and Engels, capitalism and the modes of production? I only say that I was just having a conversation with an anthropologist friend. We were talking about a group of, I think, like Pacific Islander people, and the idea, I think it's called a potlatch, and there would be at the end of the harvest, there is, so much extra, and kind of like your social rank would be based on how much you were able to give away. Basically, there would be like a big potluck, and whoever had the biggest potluck would be have the most social status. And it seems to me that is a mode of production, and you still can kind of look at how a society is structured based around it, but it's pre-industrial capitalism.
And it's pre-class. And it's important to point out that this historical materialism develops out of class society, right? And the necessity of analyzing it. And Engels actually points out that the majority of human history happens before this. There's a little caveat in the Communist Manifesto where they say that the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. If you read, there's like a little asterisk, and it basically says history of class societies. Before that, things were different. I would say that historical materialism and the dialectical method absolutely can show us how this is created, but that we have to remember that it's not class society we're talking about. The contradiction is between society and nature, and that is primary. And this creates the contradiction between the classes within class society. Did you want to add something to that, Carlos? Or I'm sorry, Ross, you had a question? You're muted, brother.
Yeah. So prior to class society, there's still a dialectic at work in just human evolution or the evolution of life, and that's what happens in the class society is a reflection of a process that's going on pre-sentience. It's already, is that right?
Yeah. So to quote Engels, and we'll get into this, nature is sort of the final proof of dialectics, right? That we have to remember that what's reflected in our brains are reflections of actual things in the real world. So we're really just seeing in the abstract processes happening, right? Did you want to add something to that, Carlos? I saw you had a hand up.
No, I'd just say that regarding what Emily said, I put something on the chat. Marcel Mauss's book on the gift and the gift societies is good on that point that she's making about certain primary communist societies and the way that giving away surplus played the role that it played in it, and really the conceptions that they had of what wealth was or success were not tied to how much one can accumulate, but to how little one needs in order to be satisfied. And there's some interesting overlaps, or there's some homologies here with how ancient Greek philosophy also thought of like wealth, and not in terms of how much you could accumulate, but again, how little you need to be satisfied with.
I think that's a really good illustration of that. And you know what I would love to go to one of those potlucks, by the way. That's all I'm thinking of right now. Like, I'm like, man, I'm getting hungry. Ed, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I almost feel like what I'm going to say is pretty elementary compared to some of the other comments. But
Don't ever feel like that, brother. This is a place where we're all learning. It's all good.
You got to remember, as a senior citizen, I spent my whole life hearing that the Soviet Union was the most evil thing, and that Marxism was. So this has taken a long time for me to get it through my thick skull. I'm a boomer. But anyway, after last week's class, it was crazy because I was watching a video, and I think I'm starting to see what we're talking about here. And I saw this video, and a guy was talking about how, you know, his emphasis was on that doctors and psychiatrists and stuff are too quick to give medication to deal with people's stress. We need to have stress. The illustration he used was that lobsters, their shell does not grow. They are born with the shell, they grow into it, and then there is stress and discomfort. And they hide under a rock, and that shell dissolves or breaks away or whatever, and they grow a new shell that's bigger, and then they go on about their business and they grow into that shell until there's stress and discomfort. And as he was saying that, the only thing I could think of with the word, and he'd say stress, I say revolution. And I said, you know, well, that makes sense to me, that we have a society, a culture, whatever, and it grows into that current structure, and then it gets uncomfortable and stressful, and then the revolution has to occur to move to the next, you know, feudalism to capitalism, capitalism to socialism, etc. So that's kind of how, and I just felt like sharing that because I hope, as simplistic as that is, I hope maybe it helps somebody who's struggling. I know it helped me, and it encouraged me, because I'm telling you, after last week, I was like, I don't think I'm getting this, and I ought to just bow out and let, you know, these young folk figure all this stuff out, you know. And then that happened, and a couple other things that just got me excited. And my wife is sick and tired of me going, honey, it's dialectic materialism. She's going, yes, honey.
Believe me, brother, I know all about wives getting sick of honey, dialectical materialism. But you are getting it. That is absolutely correct. That is application of dialectical materialism to what you're seeing around you. That lobster turning into the new, higher developed stage of the lobster is a revolutionary change. That is that's precisely what it is. And you thinking revolution, spot on. So I don't know what you're talking about, not getting it. That all I see is good things. And believe me, it's taking you a lot less time than it took me. I just want to make that clear for everyone here. Maybe I'm just kind of an idiot. I don't know. I mean, let's be real. I am kind of an idiot, but maybe I'm just a slow learner. You guys are all getting this and picking it up a lot easier than it was for me back when I was learning it. Like I said, it had to be sort of like shoved down my throat. And I sort of ended up learning it out of spite after all. Anyway, that's just me. No, Ed, you're doing great, brother. I'm very excited to see that sort of thing. And seeing that sort of like when it begins to click, that's everything. That's everything. Was Sam, I think you were next, or was it Cheryl?
I just had a quick clarifying question. Could you, or anyone that knows, give me some context information about what a burger is, as in the ruling figure? I'm familiar with the sandwich known as a burger. My only understanding is there's this old Santa Claus animation called Santa Claus is Coming to Town, where the Meister Burger or whatever is one of the villains or something. But all I know is there's somewhat like a mayor something like that. So just for some historical context. Thank you.
So a Burgermeister is what they call me on May Day during the barbecue. I apologize for that one. No, a burger, he's using it in like a very oldie-timey way. There is a sort of official sort of local government in early like very early bourgeois society called burger, but what he's speaking about are city dwellers. Bourgeoisie itself develops out of these sort of words and means city dweller. So it was the sort of more well-off people who were already in the city that became this bourgeois class. So the burghers were the, guild journeymen and masters that would have on apprentices, right? That became the big bourgeoisie that, like Engels was saying, were buying out all the small ones, the small proprietors. So they became the bourgeoisie, the burghers, the city dwellers, basically. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Several little things. The burghers, at least in Germany, they were the citizens of a city. They had more rights than people who were just allowed to be there sometimes. And I love puns. I'm also a senior citizen, so there's a few of us here.
We respect our elders around here, believe me.
That's right, you should. Revolution is a really weird word because it means both a drastic change and going around in a circle and coming back to where you were. And no, I have one comment about speed of learning. I think maybe because you were encouraged to do socialism by your parents, it took you a long time to come around to deciding that maybe your parents were right. But since my parents were such capitalistic idiots, my rebellion was looking at socialism.
Yeah, mine was becoming an anarchist and moving to LA. Embarrassing time of my life. Thank you for that, Cheryl. And thank you for adding, especially in the early German city-states, the burghers being citizens. That's a really, really important point.
Yeah, I kind of have an interest in Germany in the mid-1700s.
You don't say.
Because of genealogy, would you believe? But I got interested in just how the society works. And so I'm kind of merging the two, making a study of it.
Absolutely. That's what got me interested in Soviet history, because it's my family's history. And what my grandparents and my family tell me wasn't adding up with what people at school said. And so I get, Stalin was a great man. He fought the corrupt local officials for us, the people. The communists brought technology at home, and then in school, the communists were all evil, and Stalin is going to eat your baby and your baby's baby. And I'm like, I don't have any babies, but apparently he was going to eat them. So really, it just took me down this road of trying to figure out what was what, because that was a hard thing for me to deal with as a kid, especially growing up during the Cold War.
Yeah. Well, I've seen with the serfs coming into being and being phased out, I just see so many similarities to today's society.
That's reproletarianization, sister. All right. So I see, Carlos, you want to say something, and so do you, Ben. We're nearing an hour and a half right now, so I want to get going with the rest of the lecture. But if it's important, go ahead and add.
Just real quick, I love that you pointed that paradox within the concept of revolution, and I think that paradox is also archetypical of the central division and the Eastern and the Western dialectic. The Eastern dialectic is somewhat circular. You have with the Tao the yin and yang and this harmony of forces that goes round and around, and revolutions in that circular sense. And then the Western dialectic, specifically with Heraclitus, the tradition of Heraclitus, Hegel, and then Marxism, is revolution in the other sense, including within it the process of denegation of the negation, or progressive, the progressive, not repetition, but the progressive progression of the contradictions that are then unfolding into each other, in each case higher and higher levels.
Very, very good point. And actually, even the word revolution, why we use it, comes from Copernicus and the discovery of the planets revolving around the sun, doing a revolution. All right, Ben, did you want to add something real quick?
Yeah, I was going to really quickly comment on the contradiction present and how it kind of embodies, and this might be just a touch advanced, but I think it'd be cool to introduce people to this concept of the Hegelian term Aufhebung, because it's extremely important, wherein it's a kind of, it's an incredibly radical movement, but in doing so, it actually preserves itself. It preserves, is it a radical changing of form which preserves essence, or is a kind of way to translate Heraclitus as overthrown its stay? Is there's a, by its very nature, changing, its actual essence is itself change. And I think that's kind of the heart of what we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, the German term Aufhebung is actually what's used and is translated in English in a lot of Marxism to the word abolish, which doesn't cover it completely. More appropriate words would be sublate or transcend. But basically, think about the revolution to socialism, right? Society itself and humanity and its progress is preserved through this break, this change from the old to the new. But yeah, that's sort of getting into sublation and preservation of essence, and all that is a little down the line from us right now. All right. Do you have one other thing to add, Cheryl, or should we go on? Do you have, just forget to put your hand up? Okay. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. All right. Section
Kind of like
2.
a turn signal.
Yeah.
The car turn signal, you put it on and you forget to take it off on the highway. And people start beeping at you because you're an asshole, but it happens to all of us.
Mm-hmm. All right. Section 2, dialectics. Everybody ready? Let's begin the dialectics section of the lecture. Well, all of the utopians thinking their thinks or thoughts, whatever, doing what they were doing their thing. And after, the new German philosophy was also actualizing, culminating in a name I'm sure everyone has heard before, and we just actually went over, but it's always sort of talked about with mystery and reverence, the name Hegel. He's really not so mysterious, though, just kind of difficult to read. Without Hegel laying the groundwork, there could have been no Marx and Engels, though. Engels says that his, or German philosophies, really, that's potato kind of thing. Anyway, he says that Hegel's greatest merit was reestablishing dialectics as the highest mode of reasoning. Many of the Greeks were master dialecticians, especially Aristotle. Of the newer philosophers, relatively speaking, of course, such as Descartes and Spinoza, there was some dialectics as well. And actually, one of our favorite thinkers, a Soviet named Dialectical, describes Spinoza as one of the originators of Hegelian thought. Anyway, Engels points out, though, that more and more the modern philosophers of his day were becoming rigidly bound to what they call metaphysical thought. And here we're going to need to pause and sort of examine what we mean when we say metaphysical in Marxism, as it's a sort of deeper and different view than you'll learn in, say, a bourgeois philosophy class. And when you're talking about different philosophers, and Carlos and I go over this all the time, how we kind of hate how Marx and Engels use that term so often. Anyway, but how they use it for Marxists, really, metaphysics is viewed in contradistinction to dialectics, where dialectics states that we must analyze things in their relations and motion. Metaphysics removes relationships and makes static that which it analyzes. A metaphysicist, for Engels, would see a seed on the ground and call it a seed, right? The dialectician would say this seed is inseparable from the processes that gave rise to it and the potential within it. It is not only a seed, but the plant it dropped from and the plant it will become, and the seeds that that plant will drop and plants those seeds will become, etc., etc. But let's sort of get into what we mean by dialectics and dialectical materialism. Are you ready for another big long quote from Engels? I know you are, don't worry. Here it goes. When we consider and reflect upon nature at large, or the history of mankind, or our intellectual activity, and you notice how he uses all of those because that's what he's been talking about. At first, we see the picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions, permutations and combinations, in which nothing remains what, where, and as it was, just like that seed didn't, right? But everything moves, changes, comes into being, and passes away. We see, therefore, at first, the picture as a whole, with its individual parts still more or less kept in the background. We observe the movements, transitions, connections, rather than the things that move, combine, and are connected. This primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world is that of ancient Greek philosophy. And Ben actually brought this name up. It was first clearly formulated by Heraclitus. Everything is and is not, right? In this way, because everything is fluid, constantly coming into being and fading away, constantly changing. Oh, geez, I just totally spaced. Constantly changing, coming into being, and passing away. This right here, this sort of view is the embryo of dialectics. Our premise is motion. Say that again. Our premise is motion. Engels goes on. He says, but this conception, correctly as it expresses the general character of the picture of appearances as a whole, does not suffice to explain the details of which this picture is made up. And so long as we do not understand these, we have not a clear idea of the whole picture. In order to understand these details, we must detach them from their natural, special causes, effects, etc. Let's actually use a picture, right? Let's think about that for a minute. If I were to focus in on the picture on my computer screen right now, right? I see it all sort of connected as one big whole, but I can't really look at what's going on in this corner of my screen because all I'm seeing is this one whole. If I want to get a fuller picture of the whole, I need to examine that corner, what those pixels are doing, etc. And I need to do that for the entire thing, right? Anyway, here we have a sort of basic formulation, right? In order to understand the parts, we must first have the whole. But also, in order to understand the whole, we must understand each part. Following so far? Good. Let's keep going. Engels explains a bit of the development of natural science in this same part, which is really interesting for me, as this examination of parts is for the large part. Sorry, I can't help myself with these puns today, I guess. The realm of natural sciences, after all. However, the way the natural sciences and developing society arises leads us to what we call a metaphysical view of them. Think about what we were talking about, the limitations of epochs, right? Because the need to understand intricate mechanisms sort of continued to grow with our productive forces and the level of scientific theory we had, and really the relations of society. It couldn't have been anything but this more mechanistic or metaphysical way of thought. Unfortunately, this sort of leaves us at looking at things in their rest, or not in motion at all, and isolated, disconnected from other things, which our original view of the whole picture should tell us is an incorrect way to view things. Let's get to another Engels quote on it. He says, to the metaphysician, things and their mental reflexes, ideas, are isolated, to be considered one after the other and apart from each other. Are objects of investigation fixed, rigid, and given once and for all. So this thing is here, and that's it. The metaphysician thinks an absolutely irreconcilable antithesis. His communication is yea, yea, nay, nay. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. And that's a really, really good line. For him, a thing either exists or it does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude each other. Cause and effect stand in a rigid antithesis, one to the other. And you know what? If we don't think about it, that can almost sound profound, you know? It's almost like common sense, as Engels points out following that quote. Unfortunately, this common sense reaches a limit for understanding things, and we must view them deeper if we are to get the whole scope of things and not limit ourselves to the surface. Think about it. At first glance, we can tell whether someone's alive or dead, right? But to this day, there are society-wide arguments over when the point of life occurs within a mother's womb. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but scientists still cannot precisely pinpoint death as it is a process. This tells us quite a lot. There is not one thing and then another, but instead one thing becoming another. So rather than, this pen, here, let's do it this way. Rather than this pen and this pen cap, two different things, right? It is this pen cap on this pen coming off of the pen, right? Two things in a process, one becoming another. So we have a capped pen, uncapped pen. Anyway, every moment of time is the preparation of the next. Every cell in our bodies is in the process of becoming and unbecoming. And Engels says something incredibly brilliant in the following section that I'm going to quote again. And if you couldn't tell by now, I love quoting Engels. There is no one I love quoting more than Engels. But we don't stop there anyway. We go even further. And that further takes us to the two poles of a contradiction, positive and negative. They are no more mutually opposed than they are mutually connected, penetrating each other and depending on each other to exist as positive and negative. And in the realm of motion, we find that rather than the surface cause creates effect, we must look at the entire interconnection of all. So what appears as cause and effect is actually part of a greater phenomenon. And they change places over and over. What's effect here and now is cause for there and then, and vice versa. This, brothers and sisters, is the core of dialectics. And it's something the metaphysical view, to use the Marx and Engels term, just doesn't take into account. This is why we're often left scratching our heads at the so-called brilliant minds of the bourgeois academy, why they often seem to leave out all context, all deeper thought. Excuse me, I am so sorry. Their mode of analysis simply leaves no room for deeper thought. As Engels points out, they cannot see the forest because of the trees. We will go into a few trees so that our view of the forest is complete. And we'll do this in the upcoming classes, don't worry. But I want us to take a moment right now, pause, and just think about what Engels is teaching us here. We don't ever want to be blinded by an individual tree and forget that the forest exists. So just take a second. Think about that. Cause becomes effect, right? Our effect becomes a cause of a new thing. If I sort of see if Wade and I see each other on the street, right? And he goes like this. That is a cause leading to the effect of me giving him a high five, right? That high five leads to a new cause, right? The cause of Wade and I being embarrassed that we just high-fived each other like 12-year-olds in 1989, right? So a cause is an effect, is a cause, is an effect. Think about that for just a minute. Like, sort of just wrap your brain around it. All right, moving on. We got the dialectical worldview from the observation of nature. And who better for Engels to mention in this regard than Darwin, whose theory of the evolution in biological life changed the natural sciences forever. He would compare Marx to him during his honestly rather beautiful eulogy for his lifelong colleague and friend, saying that, quote, just as Darwin discovered the laws of evolution in organic life, so Marx discovered the laws of evolution in human history. Excuse me, I am so sorry. I'm getting heartburn. Engels was just sort of like that, though. Though it is thoroughly impossible to tell the exact origin of any theory, as it was generally almost always fleshed out between the two thinkers, Engels always pointed out that Marx was the more towering genius of the two. Anyway, this is how we go beyond the confines of the previous epoch that we were talking about earlier, right? Understanding that history does not go in an endless circle of repetition, but instead has a real history, cause into effect, into cause into effect. To understand this real history, to reason about it, think about it, can only be done in the dialectical worldview. This is where German philosophy comes in. Kant, a name I'm sure you've all heard, began his career by resolving the stable solar system of Newton. Kant, this philosopher, begins with Isaac Newton. He explains a historical process of the development of the sun and all the planets out of a nebulous and moving mass. Sort of the Big Bang, right? Sort of. This leads him to the conclusion that the solar system must have an end, right? Without death, there is no life. This Kantian embryo really culminates in the Hegelian system. And that is what all the hubbub is about. So for the first time, when we get to Hegel, he puts all of history, the whole world, nature, society, thought, everything into a process. And this is the brilliance of Hegel. Really, the recognition that history is, well, history. Before that, it was not thought of in such a way. He recognizes that everything in history is in action, motion. With Hegel, the history of humanity was no longer a chaotic and arbitrary memorization of dates and deeds with no order to it, but a vast, interconnected web of actions and reactions becoming actions, and actions becoming reactions, cause and effect and cause, interpenetration and motion in everything. For Hegel, it was a task of the intellect to understand these things. To, as Engels puts it, quote, trace out the inner law running through all this apparently accidental phenomena. And what is familiar about that? The inner law, right? Understanding the laws by which we develop, we become us. Of course, it was, just as the utopians were, limited by its epoch. It would fall to the further development of society to produce a Marx or an Engels, and then a Lenin, a Du Bois, a Mao, and so on into today, where it produces you and me. It produces us. It took the development of the purity fetish, for instance, and its forms it takes today for Carlos to develop the theory of the purity fetish, right? The point, though, is that the Hegelian system didn't solve the problem of history. It's an ongoing process no single individual can lay claim to. It is a task of all of us, of humanity. Secondly, and maybe Carlos can expound on this better than I can, Hegel was an idealist. We refer to him as a proto-materialist because he laid the ground for Marxist materialism. But it would fall to the epoch after him for that to happen, right? And I think Hegel would take interest in understanding what his own mistakes were, his own limitations, and the necessity of his proto-materialism in producing the developed materialism of Marxism. I'm going to quote Engels here one more time before seeing if Carlos wants to add anything. Engels says to Hegel, to him, the thoughts within his brain were not the more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things and their evolution were the realized pictures of what he called the idea, the sort of maturation of the human spirit and consciousness, existing from somewhere eternity before the world was. This way of thinking turned everything upside down and completely reversed the actual connection of things in the world. Correctly and ingeniously, as many groups of facts were grasped by Hegel, for the reasons we just gave, there is much that is botched, artificial, and wrong in points of detail. And here's the point: wrong in point of detail. As Marx and Engels come along, they discover Hegel, as Marx says, standing on his head. The logic is there. The system is there. And to turn him right side up, they simply replace his notion of the idea with material reality as primary, producing those abstract pictures of actual things and processes. And this, brothers and sisters, is the Marxist worldview. Carlos, do you want to add anything for us on Hegel while we're here?
Yeah, that's a difficult point. You know, we have this paradox where, as Marxist Leninist, Lenin of course says that to fully understand Marx's Capital, you need to have understood the whole of Hegel's science of logic. And then he proceeds to say, therefore, no one has really understood Marx in the last few decades, which, if that's the standard you have for understanding Marx, is understandable that no one would understand them, because if anyone's familiar with the science of logic, it's a massive 800-page tome, extremely difficult to read. Difficult to read when translated, but even in German, it's very difficult to read. But whatever, what's the substance of Lenin's statement is that without understanding dialectics and the movements that one can observe in Hegel's work, even if it's embedded within an ontology, a way of thinking about the world, about the question of existence and being that's idealistic, even if it's embedded in that, the logic of the movement is one that's replicated then in Marxism. That's the sense in which he says that we have to understand Hegel. Now, I don't think this is a basics of Marxism course, so we shouldn't be going into Hegel. It's far too advanced. I hope to, when I do my history of philosophy course, which I think should be ready within 2 weeks to be done. I hope to have certain excerpts from various parts of Hegel's work, but it's very dangerous to just engage with one part of Hegel. There's a lot of people who just comment on parts of Hegel, and if you're aware of the whole context, it ends up looking bad, because usually like 80 to 90% of what Hegel's doing in his work is quoting various periods in the history of thought. And so if you pick just one side, you're saying Hegel said this, but really he didn't say that. He's presenting that as a view that's a historical moment that's necessary for him to get to his point. What I would say, I want to give a comment. We start here in this text with the distinction in this chapter between metaphysics and dialectics. It continues to unfortunately reappear in all of the classics of Marxism. It reappears in Mao's On Contradiction, which is one of the texts that develops dialectics better than I think any in the 20th century. But it reappears there as these two distinctions in the history of thought, these two lanes. And I think that's incorrect, because what metaphysics really stands for originally is just, break it down, metaphysics. It's a term that develops after the incorporation of the body of work of Aristotle, and it really means that work which is after his physics, that deals not just with the direct empirical observation of things, but with certain interconnections that requires mental abstractions in order to understand. And so Hegel has a quote that it kind of makes fun of Newton's quote. Newton has a quote that says, physics, beware of metaphysics. And the point that Hegel wants to make is that human thinking is metaphysical in substance, right? We need this process of abstraction in order to think correctly. When I think of fruit, I'm making an abstraction. When I think of even a type of fruit, apple, I'm making an abstraction, right? There's no apple that I can point at and say, this is what I mean by apple, right? Specific, and embodies all the characteristics of apple in general. So abstraction is necessary. That's what is referred to in general by metaphysics, right? That operation of the mind that's beyond just the descriptive reproduction of facts in the world. The central difference, what is it that you wanted me to cover, the difference, the transition in the dialectic from Hegel to Marxism, or
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered what I wanted to sort of focus on, which is two things. Hegel, sort of one, if we don't understand the sort of a more broad approach to Engels' work, it seems as if we could dismiss Hegel through this. And I want to sort of point out his importance in that, and why his idealism is proto-materialism. That's one. And the second was the use of metaphysics and why it bothers us. So you got those pretty well.
One thing I would say about the transition from Hegel's dialectics to the Marxist, there's three images, and I have a chapter in an upcoming book about this, the transition from Hegel to Marx. There's three images that they paint. They paint the image of dialectics being upside down with Hegel. They turn it right side up. They paint the image of the rational kernel and the mystical shell. There's a rational kernel in Hegel, which is the method, the logic, and then the mystical shell is the system. And then there's the image of sublation, which is the one that's least used. It's used only once by Engels in his Ludwig Feuerbach. And this image says that really what Marxism does is overcome Hegel, take Hegel where Hegel was unable to go to because of his time, and remove some of the things that have become irrational with time. And in that sense, it's really taking Hegel to where Hegel would have gone had he continued to be alive. Because really for Hegel, the essence of philosophy is the ability to grasp your own time in thought. And part of Marx and Engels' time, as well as ours, is living in a world that's fragmented by these various different operations of capitalism and class that we've been talking about. The essence of the difference in the dialectics is that one is idealist, which is the Hegelian. It's not idealist in any way the term has been used before. Hegel's not postulating this realm of idea that's fully separated from material reality. He would very much agree with the statement that Engels makes that you cannot separate thought from matter, which thinks. He's also not an idealist in like the sense of Bishop Berkeley, where he wants to reduce any idea of material reality to just being thought, right? So those are the two central ways that idealism has been formulated in the past. One is objective idealism, the other one is subjective idealism. And I don't think Hegel really fits neatly into either one, because for him, ideas only obtain meaning when they are concretized, when they can be embodied in people and in institutions and in human action and in collective people's activities. Without that, ideas are empty and they're meaningless for him. Now, there is an argument which could be made that while that step is itself a pseudo-materialist step, which contains, as Lenin used to argue, the germs of both dialectical materialism, but then when he applied it to history, of historical materialism, there is a way which we could say that Hegel's a proto-materialist. However, what doesn't make him a materialist in the sense of Marxism and dialectical materialism is that he still sees that really the living spirit that's behind the movement in nature and the living spirit that's behind the movement in human history is the idea, right? It's ideas, it's the conceptions that people hold, which are at the root of the development of human history. And what we would do is say, let's go deeper than that. What shapes people's ideas themselves? And we would see that at the root of this ideological development, of this development in the ideal, what Hegel would describe as the Weltgeist, the world spirit, the root of that development is in the relations of production, right? In material, objective relations between human beings that then become objectivized in the ideal social realm, in ideas and in institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So in that way, we concretize Hegel. The interesting thing is, which is something that Lenin and Bukharin had noticed, that in Hegel's philosophy of history, in order to make sense of the transitions from one period to another, he almost understood that you couldn't just base it on the idea. And so you see in various epochs where he has to go towards the development of a specific instrument of production, a development of technology, a development of certain relations of production in order to explain the movement towards a new zeitgeist, towards a new spirit of an age. So that's what makes Hegel an idealist, but he's an idealist only really in comparison to us and our form of dialectical materialism. And in comparison to the history of philosophy, he is in our philosophical tradition, a tradition which tries to overcome binaries, which sees contradiction as the root of all movement, which sees movement as incessant. If there's anything that doesn't stop, is movement itself. The absence of stopping is the only thing that actually never stops. And that sees everything in this universal interconnection to everything else. Those are really the principles of dialectics: interconnection, movement, and contradiction. And insofar as we can speak about metaphysics in the ways that Marx, Engels, Lenin, and others have done so, what it really ends up just meaning, what they mean by metaphysics, is just the absence of thinking that is in tune with movement, contradiction, and interconnection. That's why they can call someone like Aristotle a dialectician and not a metaphysician, when Aristotle is itself like the basis of pretty much most metaphysics that ends up being done, even the scholastic metaphysics, which is primarily Aristotelian. But yeah, if I don't control myself, I can, keep talking for the next 2 hours. But please,
it's all right.
Thank you. And stop me.
It's all right. Thank you so much for that, brother. I think what Carlos was just saying is why Engels makes sure to point out German philosophy. And this is almost synonymous with Hegel, right? And what comes directly after Hegel, of which Engels was a part. But I think that's a good way to understand the transition from Hegel to Marx, right? That Hegel is idealism in the real world. It is idealism based in the real, ideas that mean nothing without the real. Rather than, and this is why we are from this school of thought and the creation of a science of history and society, rather than the Hegel being connected to the sort of subjectivists and postmodern thinkers of today that think that nothing is real and there's no such thing as truth and that kind of weird stuff. Anyway, this is sort of getting us back to where we were. We're beginning to think like Marxists at this point. But I want to make something clear that's not really in the pamphlet, but written in other places. As the system was being developed, it would have been impossible to do it wholesale, right, all at once. It came like everything in society in bits and pieces, quantitative change producing qualitative change, and these abstract pictures of actual things and processes. We have a word for how we think about this as well, and how we give ourselves the sort of ability to understand these abstract processes that are reflected in our brains. And I lost my place. Oh, here we go. Marx called it the ascension to the concrete, right? And this is taking those abstract pictures, images, etc., of actual existing things in the world and looking beneath the surface, seeing them in their motion according to the opposed interpenetrating opposites that propel that motion and in their connection to others. So when we do that, basically that's the process of ascending to the concrete. We'll go over how to do that in detail in another class, but just for our purposes here, I wanted to mention that this is essential to the thought. We can't really learn about dialectics without ascending to the concrete. I know I said that in sort of a confusing way because it was meant to follow what I was saying, and Carlos sort of went off in a different direction. It's okay.
If you want, if I can, there's a quick example that I usually give to explain the ascension to the concrete.
That's exactly what I was about to do. So go for it. Bro.
Okay, yeah.
No, go for it.
If you have, I did the short video a while back, which was on Bob Ross paintings, and I gave the example of the formation of a painting as a form of ascension to the concrete. You have the beginning, you have first an empty canvas, which is the most abstract you can get, because in order to ascend towards the concrete, you have to start at the abstract. And we have this usual quotidian understanding of what concrete is, where someone says, we got to start with the concrete, and they almost want to start touching shit. They're like, here's the concrete, and then the abstract is just this realm of thought that's separated. That's not how neither Hegel nor Marxism uses it. For them, the concrete, and this is a quote that's basically repeated in Marxist manuscripts, and it's also repeated in Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. The concrete is a unity of diverse determinations, which means the most concrete is always the totality, because it's that which contains the most plurality within it, the most factors, it's the most complex, right? So the ascension to the concrete is really the process through which we come to know things comprehensively, which means we need to always account for a plurality of variables, the connection that they have to each other, the way in which they are developing. That means we need to be attuned to the ways that they change and how that change is related to the interconnections that they're in, and the contradictions that are embedded both within those things and between those things, so internal and external contradictions. And that's essential in the process of ascension. So when you're starting a painting, you're starting with an empty canvas. You might have a general idea, but the idea ends up really becoming real as you begin painting it. And you begin painting it piece by piece. You don't just boom, you have straight image and that's it. Now you understand it, right? If you skip from, you know, Bob Ross telling you hello and showing you his squirrel to like the 29-minute mark, you're not going to really understand the painting unless you are yourself a painter and you have some idea of how to reconstruct that ascension towards the full painting. But it's the fact that you can see Bob, doing his little painting, that you can begin to make sense of something that's extremely complex, such as painting. And it's because you saw it in its development. You saw the role that him laying the blue background at the top, and then the different type of blood. You saw the role of everything and how it kept on concretizing until you finished with the most concrete, which is the totality of the painting itself. And you recognize that in order to understand that painting well, that process of ascension was fundamental, right? And even if you don't have it, the people who can understand it best are the ones that can almost intuitively, because they've done it before, recreate that process of ascension. And, there's these common sense things that we recognize in our everyday life. Like, we wouldn't trust a boxing judge that got there on the 12th round and passed a judgment on the whole fight. Why? Because he didn't understand the whole fight, because he wasn't there to see how it developed from the first round to the 12th round, which means he wasn't able to see it concretize. He wasn't able to see the ascension towards the concrete being here, the totality of the fight itself, right? So we understand that. We wouldn't trust that judge because he wasn't there the whole time. That means that we wouldn't trust someone who passes judgment in a way that doesn't ascend from the abstract to the concrete. We recognize that as fundamental.
Thank you so much for adding that, brother. That's a lot more in depth than my thing was. I was just going to mention the utopians who couldn't see the forest for the trees, right? The concretization or ascension to the concrete and understanding the most concrete form of this forest is understanding each tree. Each tree is a factor that makes up that forest. It is understanding the relationship between those trees, right? That this giant redwood, for example, has roots that go all the way throughout the ground, and they sort of interpenetrate with the roots of another and create a whole system in which water gets to all of them. So as we understand all of these factors that make up the facts of this forest becomes more concrete forest. And that's what the ascension of the concrete is in basic terms. Carlos more spelled it out in a detailed way. So you have sort of both views there.
Which is a process of mental abstraction as well, right?
It is, absolutely.
It's what we'd call a concrete abstraction, not an abstract abstraction.
Anyway, this sort of necessarily leads us to turn Hegel on, right back on his feet, right? Put him upside down, right side up again, upside down. One of those two, right side up. Anyway, it leads us to the materialist conception of history. It does not, however, lead us to the bourgeois versions of materialism that came before it, which saw movement only mechanically. And this is really important to understand the difference between mechanism and the Marxist conception of motion. And this is something I sort of mentioned earlier, that I see even people. I'm right now having a conversation with an older comrade who makes mistakes of mechanism like this. And it's sort of the note. So it's easy to fall into is what I mean. This guy's awesome. He's super nice guy, but he makes these mistakes. Mechanism is sort of the notion that change can all just pile up upon itself. And then suddenly we have a new thing, right? Rather than a whole series of interpenetrating causes and effects becoming causes and effects, reactions and actions, etc. The sort of development then undevelopment of things. Anyway, society hadn't advanced at that point, though, to go beyond mechanism. And so all of the discoveries made before that culminate in this creation. The materialism of this era, rather than the previous, becomes dialectical, as natural science shows us that nature as a whole must, to quote Engels, still be said to move in recurrent cycles, but that these, quote, cycles assume infinitely larger dimensions, meaning they pass through a real history. These cycles have a history to them. They have a beginning and end point, right? They have a whole process. These are the development in spirals that Lenin talked about last week. At this point, philosophy being called the science of sciences, which was sort of what it was called in the oldie-timey olden times, that becomes obsolete and no longer needs to lord itself over the other sciences, queen-like, to use Hegel's term. Hegel, as the Soviets said, becomes the last philosopher, and everything else is subsumed in the positive science of nature and history. While all of this thought is going on, society is still doing its thing, though. As Engels is quick to point out, we begin seeing working class movements arrive, right? The Chartists in England, for instance, happens around this time. Engels tells us that it advanced, quote, in proportion to the development on the one hand of modern industry and on the other of the newly acquired political supremacy of the bourgeoisie. And what is that, right? That is the forces of production, creating new relations of production, the economic base, having a superstructure built out of it on top of it. These real world phenomena showed all the bourgeois talk of the day of the common interests of capital and labor, of universal harmony and prosperity that would be the consequence of their unbridled industrial competition for exactly what it was: straight up bullshit. And they continue that bullshit to this day. Anyway, these phenomena made it absolutely imperative to set our scientific world outlook to the task of understanding it all. This happens just as it develops, right? It causes it to develop, and it gives rise to the observation that history of all hitherto existing society after the advent of property has been the history of class struggles, different forms of classes arising from different relations of production, arising from different modes of production, arising from different technologies within production, all based on the motion of production itself, because that is how we go about being society. We analyze this through precisely the system we've been describing the past however long I've been talking. It was this brilliant discovery that put socialism on a scientific footing. From then on, socialism could not be some accidental discovery that could have occurred 500 years ago or yesterday or tomorrow, but instead an integral part of the real history of humanity and society. With our dialectical materialist worldview, we see where the dialectical materialist worldview fits in the process of society. We can instead understand the rise of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, unlike the sort of accidental discovery theory, right? We can understand the conflict between us, and from there, understand the means of resolving this conflict once and for all. The last thing that Engels points out is that this happens in the material world around the discovery of surplus value. The appropriation of unpaid labor is the entire basis of the capitalist mode of production. To quote Engels here, even if the capitalist buys the labor power of the worker at its full value as a commodity on the market, he yet extracts more value from it than he paid for it. And this right here is how the accumulation of capital is possible, right? That's what surplus value is. And I'm going to end here by quoting Engels one last time, because what he's doing here, before I do that, is showing you the sort of end result of all of this, right? This culminates in surplus value, in the ability to understand and become conscious of class society and our place within it and how that affects us and what we can do. This is, by the way, Hegel's sort of idea. This is us becoming conscious. Class consciousness is playing a big part. Anyway, I'll end here by quoting Engels. These two great discoveries, the materialist conception of history and the revelation of the secret of surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism becomes a science. The next thing was to work out all its details and relations. And that next thing will have to wait until next week, because I am sure there are a whole bunch of things that we got to talk about right now. That's the entire lecture. So I'm sure there are a bunch of questions and comments and everything else. Lay them on me. Go ahead, Ross.
Can I just thank Carlos? I've been, reading philosophy for, on and off 20 years. That's the first time I've ever understood Hegel properly. Thank you. So thank you.
I'm a very lucky man in that I get to call this guy at like 8 a.m. when I'm reading Science and Logic and have questions about, what precisely he means by pure being and that kind of stuff.
It's unfortunate because often the ideas are not that difficult. And part of what I try to do is bring up common sense examples to describe them, to show that a lot of these things we already know, but we just don't know that we know them. And we don't know them in the language in which Hegel describes them. He did himself a disservice by writing in the way that he wrote, because I think the essence of what he was getting at could have been expressed a lot simpler. But that's it. By the way, congrats to Noah. Doing a lecture is a whole different monster from doing a read along, and I think you did a wonderful job, brother.
Thank you so much, brother. And thank you everybody who was, saying good job and giving thumbs up. I really appreciate all of y'all. Excuse me, I'm already dropping my professional pace after that. You see that? You hear the y'all slipping out? Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to ask, very early on in the lecture, you talked about how, like you said, yes, yes, and no, no. I was just having trouble wrapping my head around, like, if both yes and no, like, have to be separate, how are they then linked?
Yes and no depend upon each other for existing as yes and no. If there's no such thing as no, there is no such thing as yes. But really, the better way to understand this is through something a lot of high school philosophy classes will teach you about Kant's theory of A cannot, or A equals A, right? It's sort of a thing is that thing and not another thing, right? Marxism says that this is not the case. A thing is the thing it was and the thing it becomes, basically, without getting far, like really deep into it, because actually this is going to be within our next part of this.
I think I kind of grasp it. It's sort of like saying, I'm like technically the same me, but I'm like growing year to year to year until I eventually die.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
In fact, you're alive and then dead, but this is a process, right? You couldn't have been alive if at some point you weren't dead. And you couldn't be dead if at some point you weren't alive.
Okay, I get it now. Thank you.
I don't remember who was first, Sam or Emily. Why don't you guys just go?
I'm gonna do it. Sorry, Emily. This is like a pretty big question that I think, like the one I asked earlier, is just one to let marinate in the brain forever. But how can we take Engels' approach to criticism of utopian socialism and apply it to, I think they call it actually existing socialism, other socialist movements, parties, individuals, with the recent runs of, fellow Christian socialists like Cornel West. Essentially, how is it that we can use critiques of existing socialism to further our own socialist movement today? Big question, I know, but just to
no,
ask.
that's a brilliant question and an important question. And I think it revolves around one of the last classes we're going to do, which is discussion of the purity fetish. Not only must we understand what the purity fetish is so that we're not embodying it ourselves and we're using a more Marxist worldview, but we must understand that others are going to. And so we need to speak in a way that can bring them in rather than set off their purity fetish and begin unnecessary divisions, right? So one of the sort of tricks I like to do is always point out that nothing is perfect and make sure you add a few critiques and state very clearly that, this is just a regular problem a regular society has, right? Everyone deals with corruption. China is no different. They had a very big problem with corruption. Just because it's socialism doesn't mean that it's some perfect society where, everybody walks hand in hand. No, they have real problems there. But there is a difference in the way they do things, being more people oriented. And I think we have a lot to learn from them and how they approach those problems. That's how I sort of go about navigating around that, making sure we criticize without condemning and canceling, etc. And always, and this is something that I think is one of the reasons people come to the Midwestern Marx Institute for education. We don't allow ourselves to get bogged down in the pointless back and forth and bickering that is just so rampant on the left. When we argue, even if the people that are trying to pick arguments with us are clearly operating in bad faith, we act as if they're not. We give them the benefit of the doubt and we're genuine with them, because even if they begin in bad faith, that can change to respect, and it can change to a productive conversation and someone involved and ready to go struggle for our class more than you'd think. Emily, do you have a question?
Yes. I had two questions. One's kind of simple. Is it correct to be thinking about then this discovery? We're reading about the discovery of surplus value as this concept, important concept in Marxism. Would that discovery or coming to that idea be an example of ascension to the concrete of that notion?
Yeah, I think so. It's sort of Marx realizing the factors that produce capitalist exploitation, right?
Yeah, and coming up with a particular, I guess, concrete idea that's a kind of a touchstone of the whole philosophy.
Right.
Second question, was there anything written or said? I know we're reading a lot about like the French Revolution and the influences of other things going on in Europe. Was there any consideration or ever any discussion by any these folks at the time of the Haitian Revolution, which also took place at the same time?
Yeah, there is, but not as much by Marx and Engels.
Okay.
I know Eddie just read a really, really good book on the Haitian Revolution, and I'm trying to remember what it was called. Do you remember which one that was, Carlos?
Sorry, I've been doing some chat responding, but the CLR James book, Haitian Revolution, is perhaps the best you can get. We have a really good article from Marius Trotter, who I think he was watching live on YouTube on our website. He's got a really good article on the French Revolution, on the Haitian Revolution, and it's really, it's kind of like a review of the CLR James book. So I recommend reading that and then the the C.L.R. James book.
C.L.R. James was a very brilliant Marxist mind as well. Just to add that in there. I believe, was it Matt, or let's go to Jay first and Matt. Or was that Emily first? Okay, cool. Go ahead, Jay.
Okay. So I think the section where in the dialectic section where he's talking about socialism no longer being an accidental discovery of an ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is it possible to go a little bit closer to your mic? I can barely hear you.
How's that?
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. I was saying, I think it's a really important section when Hegel's making the difference between, or Engels, between socialism being like an accidental discovery versus like a necessary outcome of a struggle. Because like when I'm going to talk to people who are not socialists or who don't really understand what it is, they have this idea of a utopian socialism where it's like, oh, we want free healthcare and like jobs for everyone and, you know, all this stuff that sounds, it can sound a lot like we're just saying these things and we want them to be true, so we're going to make them true. So I guess the question kind of is like, how have you felt it best to go about explaining to someone like, we're not saying society should be X because we feel like it, but we're actually analyzing the struggle of society and trying to figure out the best way to end that conflict by like a scientific approach. How have you found the best way to do that so far?
I think what you just said is very good. That they sort of what you'll get is people go, well, I've heard that socialism doesn't work because you try to do these policies to make everyone equal, and then it all falls apart, and then Stalin eats your babies, right? But what I do is go, look, there's everything you've heard about socialism, first of all, is wrong. So let's throw that out the window. What we're trying to do is understand how society moves, what forces us to act, and like sort of how does society get to a point where it can no longer go on in the old way. And then those problems create the way we think about possible solutions to those problems, right? They create the way we're able to organize ourselves to overcome those problems. And that's the way I sort of approach it in a more, the revolution is in a very real sense, each particular revolution overall. So the American Revolution, I tell them, is only going to be an American revolution. It will only lead to American socialism. We're not importing Soviet socialism. We're not importing Chinese socialism or Cuban socialism. It'll only come into being as the organic creation of how our progressive forces go about resolving the problems within our society.
Can I piggyback off of that? 'Cause
sorry to be so late. Sorry, y'all. Thank you for doing this.
Wait, hold on, that Jay, real quick. First, Jay with
Oh,
a
my
Y.
bad. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Does that help answer your question?
It does. I think Carlos is going to say some more on it though. So.
Oh, great.
yes, because I had an interaction before the semester closed out with a non-traditional student. It was a man in his 40s, and he's a libertarian, and he's one of my students. And he was trying to grapple with these ideas. And I just asked him about his workplace. And he was telling me about how they had so much shit that they produced, and that because companies couldn't buy it because they aren't able to sell it at this moment because no one has money, they just have to throw it away. And he was like, this is just kind of irrational. And then you get into a conversation of, well, how it was that Marx was able to predict this tendency, how it's rooted in commodity production and these contradictions that exist at the foundation of society. And you ask him, well, how can we prevent that from happening? And the answer cannot be any other than moving away from a system that produces on the basis of realizing surplus value, of producing for the sake of profit, and moving towards a system where production is carried out on the basis of meeting people's needs and on producing on the basis of use value, and on having the people that produce be able to decide what's produced for society, have a society that works for itself. It just makes sense, right? And it's not the same as like when the utopians developed a scheme of how class antagonisms are going to be harmonized, and they go very descriptive in all the accidental properties of what this new society is going to look like. It's completely different because it's grounded in their everyday life and in the solutions that they themselves would almost intuitively come up with, because they're the ones that are living through the problems that we are describing scientifically. So that inquiry basis, I think Socratic method of sort, is always important in helping people see what some of these differences are. But the essence of scientific socialism, I would say, as opposed to utopian socialism, there's a few factors, but I think the most essential one is the fact that we don't conceive of socialism as an escape from capitalism. We're not going to Indiana to create New Harmony and create our nice little utopian community as Robert Owens did with William McClure and a few other utopian socialists. We see that in capitalism itself is the potential for socialism. And once we can help people understand conceptually the operations and the relations that they are already living in and they experience in their life world, we can help them see the way forward, because we ourselves understand the way forward scientifically. And we see that it's only by going through the system, not by going around it or doing some other movement. It's going through the system itself points the way forward. And that's what makes it not utopian.
That's really, really well said, brother. I just want to add one quick thing that I say all the time that you guys may have heard me say. Ask a coworker, a friend, a random person you're talking to, aren't you sick of working all day, 5 days a week to make somebody else rich? And they will be. Aren't you getting tired of that? Aren't you sick of and tired of struggling paycheck to paycheck? And then connect that to the system that makes it that way. And sort of ask questions along with them. Go, why do you think that is? I mean, it's not like we're incapable. We're all smart people. We're strong people. Why is it that we're stuck sort of slaving away for the rich while they sit in fancy offices, doing nothing, counting the money that we make them? I think that really gets people's heads in the right spot. And if you can sort of ask questions and help them answer themselves along with them, that allows them to come to the conclusions on their own with your help, rather than having, the typical know-it-all lefty telling them what time it is. I believe Matt was next, correct?
Yeah, my question was kind of relating to what you were just talking about. So I guess Marx appeared in when he appeared, and you were like you said earlier, we're kind of unlucky they didn't show up 500 years sooner, because we could have sped things up. But in the same way that both Lenin and Mao were able to progress socialism and Marxism because they were physically in their own revolutionary context, would the United States have once we get to that sort of phase of socialism where things are progressing, is there going to be that sort of next Marx-esque figure who's able to realize the new contradictions that create itself as socialism becomes the dominant form of production, if and when that happens?
Look at the way Carlos and I are looking at you, right? This is where we live, brother. Right here. So I want to be very careful, though. Lenin updates Marxism for the period of imperialism. Mao was living within that period as well. What Mao did that was brilliant and expert was apply that Marxism, Leninism to the Chinese situation in a way that had never been done before. He represents the sort of regional particular form rather than the temporal particular form of Marxism, right? So his big contribution, I mean, think about the Chinese Revolution. That wasn't the proletariat. That was the peasantry. And that was mind-blowing, right? The Soviets actually originally disallowed the peasantry from the dictatorship of the proletariat. It took a lot of class struggles and Stalin and the strength of his political force to bring the entire mass of working people into that. But that's a whole other thing. About now, we go through these sort of periods, right? Rise and falls, developments and undevelopments. And just as capitalism hits a higher stage and develops into imperialism, imperialism can be said to go in stages, development and undevelopment, just at a different level. And for us, we say that we are now in a new stage of imperialism. There's two things I want to hit on this. One, we have a Mao-like figure here. It's W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois works out the primary class contradictions of the most revolutionary epochs in American history. And he works out the problem of half of the USA's existence, which is the problem of the color line. And this is formulated as a mode of class struggle, right? Even when he's a younger Du Bois, not come into his own yet, this is the logic and direction of his thought. And so Du Bois and his work on class and race, which, I mean, you need to only look around and see, A, that this has been a primary thing in the US, and B, that it's radically changed over the course of history following these sort of developments of capitalism, to understand Du Bois as what we call the father of American Marxism. Now, the second thing is that what we call American Marxism is now forming in this new era of imperialism, the higher stage of imperialism, the stage of the reproletariat, right? The stage of reproletarianization. And it requires understanding the last period, and that is understanding the purity fetish and the failure of the last period's left, the retreat of the left after the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is all sort of, I mean, it's a lot to throw at you right now. I just wanted to let you know that this is sort of like the question of the era. How do we theorize our country's history, our unique class struggles, and where we are right now? And I just want to let you know your head's in the right place because those are the right questions. And like I said, that's where we live. Did you want to add anything to that, Carlos, or do you want to get along with more questions?
Sure. Just something real quick. A point that's made by Dimitrov is that socialism is always going to develop in the following form, which is a basic law of dialectics. Socialism is going to function as the content which takes form, which takes different national forms. Socialism is a universal. In order to actually exist, it does not exist disconnected from the world. It exists concretized in different particulars. That means in different nations. And it's always going to have the characteristics, the formal properties of those particulars. In Russia, it took a specific form. In China, it takes the form of socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Cuba, they rescue their legacy. It's the same in literally every single place that it's taken root in. It's taken the form of the national past of the peoples that have waged and won the struggle for socialism. The analysis, the Marxist analysis, has to do something very similar in their approach to analyzing the class struggle in one's context, because class struggles in general don't exist in a pure form. They always take a determinate form. And in the US, the struggle against racism and the struggle against the false consciousness, which is proliferating in white workers to separate one part of the labor movement from another, has been at the forefront of the struggle of labor against capital. And the first person to properly understand the form that the class struggle took here was W.B. Du Bois. It's a tradition that's then developed in the Communist Party with William Z. Foster, Winston, Herbert Aptheker, and a few other people. But the first person to grasp that pulse of our class struggle was Du Bois. There was Marxists before that, but they ignored the struggle against racism. They would write big tomes on the history of socialism in the US and exclude the emancipation of 4 million Black workers, enslaved proletarians in the South. They ignored the dictatorship of the proletariat that was created in southern states in the Reconstruction period. They ignored all of that. And in ignoring that, they would not be able to understand the particular form that class struggle takes here in the US. In our modern iterations of those blind sites, you have people who ignore the effects of the civil rights revolution, who think that we're still existing in 1950s America. And some factors are similar to that, but others are not. We have to be able to see how each of these transformations has transformed political society, civil society, and the forms of intercourse that dictate the relationality of the American people. Today, the American people are very different from what they were 70 years ago. And although, of course, racism is still around, racist institutions are still around, there's still a very clear geographically seen color line, right? Noah grew up in Ohio, you know, in Cleveland, Ohio. There's a very clear color line there. There's very clear color lines all around the United States. The American people are today, and I'm here echoing Dr. Monteiro, less racist than they've ever been. And that means that that which has prevented the ability of working people to struggle together for their interests as a united class is today less of an active component than it's ever been. That means that we have not only to look forward to the fact that the ruling class can't rule in the old way. That means they're going through a crisis of legitimacy, and people are not willing to continue in the old way. The vast majority of the American population rejects there's like a 20% favorability of Congress. But we also have to be appreciative and cognizant of these changes in the consciousness of the American people that make struggling together as one working class today more fertile than at any other period in US history. Today, a united, racially diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-sexual orientations class struggle in the US is the conditions for that is more fertile than it's ever been.
I mean, what further evidence do you have than to look around us? Look how diverse our group is. You know, if this were 1960, this would not have happened like this. Thank you. That was beautifully said, brother. I believe you were next, JB. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I'm just going over in my head the whole dialectics of socialism, and I think in word pictures that helps me to grasp things a little bit more easily. I wish Eddie were here; he would get this part. But has anybody ever played Final Fantasy VII?
Eddie would definitely be the one to get that. To shame
Yeah,
you.
That's a bummer because I play some video games too, but they're very random. They're like what my son picks out. So
okay, well, okay. So there's a part where they're at a reactor, and on top of this reactor is this condor. It's called Fort Condor, and this condor, what you find out is that this condor is overlooking this egg. This condor is huge. It's stories high tall. And the egg is at least like 2 stories tall. But what happens is right when the egg cracks and the new chick is born, this fire comes out and destroys the mother condor. And the mother condor dies. But then the new baby condor comes out and flies away. And in that, you think about the mother condor was capitalism. And and out of that, even though I kind of think of it almost like the birth process. A lot of people saw that oh, wait a minute, we're pregnant with the possibility of socialism over time. And so they saw through the gestation over time. And some people were like, wait, are we about to have the baby? No, because we look at it like, no, you were only 4 months. Now we're at 6 months. And then those people who are at 6 months said, no, you know what? Nah, they were only at 6 months. And it starts to feel like, are we at the 9-month period? Because as the pregnancy happens, you start to go through a pang of distress that happens, and then the contractions start to happen. And then what we're doing is we know that this is going to happen, but in order to make sure that the pregnancy or the birth goes well, we're going through a Lamaze processes. We're doing the breathing, we're doing the walking, we're doing all these different things to help the pregnancy along so that it goes more successfully instead of it being a miscarriage. So the miscarriage would be fascism taking over. The actual pregnancy would be socialism actually taking over, and the proletariat actually being the dictatorship of the proletariat instead of it being a dictatorship of the market forces that want to keep us under. So that's what it feels like to me. And then to add on to what Carlos was saying about
real quick,
types of
Jay, hold on.
Sorry,
We'll get to this right after that. I want to hear your second thing, but that is one of the most apt analogies I've ever heard in my life. And I've heard a lot of analogies for this. Very, very well said, brother. You are again incredibly insightful with this. Also, just a fun fact, Marx used to use the pregnancy analogy himself all the time.
Oh.
And even if you look up like Marx womb, you'll just find a whole big old list of things he said about it. It's sometimes wild to see us sort of coming to these same conclusions that Marx did, all on our own without having learned, had Marx read it to or say it to us. That was your thought. That was original, and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Very well said.
Yes, he's got almost identical quotes. He's got one that's revolution is the midwife of history.
Of every old society pregnant with the new.
That's another one, and he's got in the Critique of the Gotha program the quote about the socialism containing the birthmarks of capitalism, especially when it's just born. It's got, in the same way that the baby still has certain features that make it visibly connected to the mother. So you're on the money there with that metaphor.
Oh, thanks. And to add to Carlos's point about different types of socialism, I think of it now. I hate to put food in this, but I think of it like potatoes, right? You can have mashed potatoes au gratin, you can have, I forgot the other type of potatoes, but they're spiraled and then you can put things in between them. But you have potato chips, you have French fries. The thing is that they all still are potatoes, but they may look and appear a little bit differently, but in their fundamentals, they're all still intrinsically the same. And so, for instance, you may favor potato chips, but I may favor French fries, but the same thing still remains the same. We still both favor potatoes. But then somebody else may come along and say, well, no, I like home fries. Okay, well, you like home fries. But the thing is that we all still have the same interest in the same thing. And so it all still starts off with potatoes. So that's what it feels like to me. I hope I didn't lessen or cheapen the explanation by that, but that's what it feels like you explain.
Not even close, especially after an incredibly insightful pregnancy analogy. I want to say, though, I use a pizza analogy all the time to get sort of people that think very dogmatically and narrowly about what socialism is. And so the issue is socialism is just the next type of society, right? It's a very general category. All it means is that the new society serves society itself. And that comes into being in certain ways due to the classes and sort of national realities in each way it comes up. So let's say that Kyle, Carlos, Jay, and I are all making pizzas at our houses, right? And me, I make a pepperoni pizza because I have pepperoni in my fridge. Jay makes a mushroom pizza because he found a mushroom in his front yard and doesn't know not to eat mushrooms you find in your yard. You should buy them from the store. Carlos makes a green pepper and onion pizza because his wife got green peppers and onions to spite him. And then Kyle makes a plain pizza because Kyle's very plain and boring and, Anyway, all of these are.
He put up the poster for Breaking Bad. How he's like the opposite of plain. He's a world historical figure with the role he played with the production of Breaking Bad.
I'm sorry. Anyway, all of these are still pizzas, right? We can't say that just because Jay has mushrooms on his pizza, it's not real pizza. No, it's pizza. It's just a different kind of pizza because different conditions created that pizza. The conditions he was in had that mushroom in the front yard that he shouldn't have eaten. Now he's sick, and what are we going to do, The conditions my pizza was in was that of having pepperoni in the house, and the conditions of Comrade was the boring condition, right? Anyway, that is just to say that the conditions are we create particular forms of general things. Each universal must concretize through a particular situation. Chinese socialism, remember, is not the same as American socialism. I know, Sam, you've had your hand up for a minute now.
Just a couple. Sorry. The first, this is really just to ask a question on behalf of Jay, spelled J-A-E. But before I do that, I just have to give a shout out to JB from Revolutionary Blackout Network. He has a great show. They have great content out there. Just had to give him a quick shout out. Second, this is kind of an offhand comment, but it kind of came up and I could not throw it in. In the United States, I don't know how this is for our comrades abroad, but people have to pay, at least in the case of my mother, had to pay for skin-to-skin contact. And that when I was born, she had to pay for the time to hold me here before I had to go off and be, an infantile baby or whatever. So just that very, very important few moments of establishing the relationship between mother and newborn is monetized, just straight out the womb. I couldn't remember where that came up, but I remember somebody talking about it. And then just before asking Jay's question, some people like to clap, and it's kind of weird to like tap the symbols and stuff. In sign language, if you ever want to clap, you just take your hands and shake them like this. So if you ever want to clap and you can't push buttons or anything or do a thumbs up, just shake the hands like that. But Jay wanted to know what the Marxist view on the Taft-Hartley Act has been, specifically in the political realm of striking. So that was Jay's question. I don't think they can be with us at the moment, so I'll take notes to share with them later. Thank you.
I think the best way to encapsulate the Marxist view of Taft-Hartley, just to start there, is a sort of visual representation, and it's this, right? It's one of the worst pieces of legislation of all time. Anything that will sort of restrict the rights of working people to fight is a blow against us. And I mean, we really don't even have time to get into the intricacies of the messed up nature of Taft-Hartley. But it is something that we could at some point talk about. And we'd be going for 2 hours if you let me go off on that kind of thing. So I believe Kyle was next, then we'll go to Wade.
Well, I had something else I wanted to say, but I'll be honest, I've forgotten it. But yeah, you guys are definitely with the fries and the pizza and the potatoes. This is how I feel right now. I'm not gonna lie. I got that Homer drool going on, and I'm getting hungry. But anyway, yeah, everything that you guys are saying is great, and appreciating all of it. So
We appreciate you too, brother. Without Kyle doing a lot of like logistical stuff, this wouldn't go off so well. Believe me. All right, Wade, your turn.
For the comment
Oh, wait, hold
for the
on.
J for the JAE comment question. They used to call it the Slave Labor Act. The protests, what people don't recognize is that in those mid 40s, after the Second World War, the rate of strikes in the US was higher than it's ever been. We think about that time as if it was the prime, the golden age of American capitalism. We had more strikes than we've ever had. And it was as a reaction to that Taft-Hartley Act, which the unions, the militant trade unions, the party, and militant organizations, they called it the Slave Labor Act.
Very, very important to add. I mean, there's a reason we feel so strongly about it, right? I'm sure all of us who know it do, and those who don't yet, you will. Don't worry. Wait, go ahead, brother.
I was just going to summarize the Taft-Hartley Act as a direct disruption of the first step that's materially required for labor to initiate a march towards socialism, which is the building up of unity in labor movements. Basically, it inhibits the organization into workers' councils. Like, you can't get into anything more sophisticated than these base blocks of labor organization. And if you try to do anything more than that, that's illegal, and then they'll crack down on you. So basically, preventing labor unity. That's the whole point of the act, is to kill socialism in the cradle.
It's sort of, and you can't read that and think it's not based on an understanding of Marxism, Leninism, and a fear of communists, especially knowing the time it was written. Because what it does is it limits people to a narrow trade unionism, is what we used to call it. But thank you for adding that, Wade. All right. I mean, we've been going for quite some time now. We just passed the 3-hour mark. So, Sam, if you have one more thing to say, go ahead.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm not sorry, actually. Never mind. For my next reading, I am really tossing it up between the origins of the family, the state, and private property. I don't think I got the order of that right. And then
private property and the state.
Private property, the state.
No, it's origins of the family, private property, and the state.
Gotcha. Thank you. Origins of the family, private property, and the state, or anti-during. Those are the two. It's not, am I going to do something else than those two? These are the next two. Origins of the family or anti-during. Do you have a recommendation of which to go just from today?
Anti-during. You will understand origin a little more deeply after anti-during.
Anti-during it will be then. Thank you.
I mean, there's a reason Lenin calls it a handbook for all class-conscious proletarians, right? Origin of the family is brilliant and gives us some really important information. Don't get me wrong, but it is not anti-during. Anti-during is heads above almost every other book in all of human history. And I'll stand by that. There's very few that compare to it. Kyle, go ahead, brother.
So I just wanted to address some consistent questions in the YouTube comments.
Sure.
People wanting to know if they are still able to join the class through the Patreon. I didn't see anything. I couldn't find it, so I wanted to clarify.
So we closed the class because it just got too big. Anything bigger is a little unwieldy. It's sort of not fair to the people taking the class. So don't worry, though. We are going to be running this class again, as well as other classes in the future. So this exact thing, the video will always be up here, but future classes will be as well, and we'll run it again, the same curriculum, just like at a college, right? You don't just have one, History 101. History 101 is available for this class and that class, et cetera, et cetera. Not only that, we have new classes starting very soon for anyone who wants to get in on them. The signups are not up yet, but our own Carlos Garrido's History of Philosophy class is next on the sort of docket. What was the next YouTube question, Kyle?
Sorry, that was it. That was the main one. There was other questions, but that was one that had to do with the class. So
cool. All right. Well, all that being said, then I think it's been a terrific night, and I think we've learned a lot. Make sure you read section 3 of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific for next week. It will be a lecture class again. We're going to run it much the same way as we ran tonight. Then after that, after we've had 2 of each type, we're going to vote on how to handle the next few classes from there. Whether we I can't talk tonight. I don't know what. Whether we prefer the read-alongs or whether we prefer the lectures. So it'll be up to all of us to come to a decision together. Which, I mean, that's how we like to do things around here. So, yeah, I really, I know I say this a lot, but you guys are brilliant. The way you're grasping this is great. It's inspiring. Keep going. I'm so excited for next week. Next week is my favorite part of almost anything Engels has ever written. And Engels is one of my favorite writers of any writers ever. So, like, I'm very, very excited for next week. I can't wait for it. You guys are making teaching this class an absolute pleasure. Does anyone have any last parting words before we go? All right. That said, I'm going to play us out. Everybody. Oh, if I can get to the correct thing, I will, huh? All right. Have a great night, everybody. We'll see you next week. Solidarity.
Without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.